the smile that disarms. You're anxious, unsure, maybe even a little lost. But then it happens. A warm hand on your shoulder, a smile that says, "You matter here." No judgment, no questions, just a gaze that seems to understand the chaos behind your eyes. And before you even realize it, your guard has slipped. This is not the kind of smile you'd expect to be dangerous. It doesn't demand, it doesn't force, it welcomes. And that's precisely its power, because something strange happens in the human mind when kindness arrives unprovoked. We mistake it for safety. We want to believe in it. And when we do, the door cracks open. That smile isn't always from a stranger. Sometimes it's from someone you've seen every day, someone who's just now showing interest in your deeper world. Other times it comes from a room full of faces turned toward you like you've been chosen, like you've always belonged. In that moment, the fear that once protected you begins to look like unnecessary caution. The skepticism that shielded your thinking starts to feel cold and isolating. It begins with empathy, or the appearance of it, a genuine-sounding question, a compliment that hits just the right wound, a shared laugh at just the right moment. The smile disarms not by overwhelming, but by aligning. They're like me, you think. They see me, and just like that, you're less alone. But what if that moment of recognition was engineered? What if that warmth was not spontaneous, but tactical? Cult leaders and those who understand manipulation have long known this trick. The fastest way into someone's belief system isn't argument, it's resonance. Make them feel understood. Make them feel seen. And they'll start wanting to believe whatever it is you believe, because belief in that context becomes the price of connection. This isn't a conscious trade. Most people don't realize they're exchanging independence for intimacy. It happens subtly, like a fog settling in. You don't feel chilled until it's already clinging to your skin. But once that smile lands, once it melts something inside you, you're already starting to drift. Not because you were weak, but because you were human. And humans crave understanding. We want our confusion held gently. We want our loneliness soothed. We want to matter to someone, and the smile that disarms knows all of this. It doesn't attack the mind. It whispers to the heart. And once the heart listens, the mind begins to follow. But that's only the beginning. Because what starts with kindness can quickly become a system, a method, a structure of emotional reinforcement so strong that even pain begins to feel like affection. The warmth you felt from that first smile, soon it's no longer offered freely. Now it's conditional. Now it's something you have to earn. You might not even notice the shift. Not at first. All you know is you want to feel it again. That glow, that welcome, that sense of being chosen. And some will go to great lengths to feel it again. Even if it means becoming someone they no longer recognize, even if it means giving more than they ever thought they would, even if it means accepting something that deep down never quite felt right. Because once you've felt seen, it's hard to go back to being invisible. And sometimes that smile you trusted turns into something else entirely. Something that doesn't just welcome you in, but makes it harder and harder to leave. And the next step, that's when the smile isn't just warm. It's everywhere. On every face, echoing back to you like a promise. But what happens when that warmth becomes overwhelming? When kindness itself becomes a net so wide and soft that you stop noticing it's wrapped around you? Sometimes the trap doesn't feel like a trap at all. It feels like love. Love bombing and belonging. You walk into the room, and for a moment, it feels like you've returned to a place you never knew you missed. Smiles meet you instantly. Hands reach out. Compliments flow like a chorus sung just for you. They say you're special, you're strong, you're finally home. And somehow, even if you're usually skeptical, even if you normally keep your distance, you begin to believe it. Love bombing doesn't look dangerous. It feels like joy. It feels like the answer to a question you were never able to phrase. You're not just accepted, you're celebrated. In a world where most people feel overlooked, this sudden wave of attention can feel like healing, like destiny, like the beginning of something you didn't even know you needed. But that's exactly why it works. Because love, in excess, overwhelms the usual filters. If someone compliments you once, you question their motives. If they do it 20 times in an hour, with tears in their eyes and arms around your shoulders, it starts to feel true. Love bombing floods the system. It's a short circuit to emotional attachment. Your nervous system doesn't have time to build its defenses. The praise isn't random either. It's precise. It targets the parts of you that feel unseen by the world. The dreams you thought no one cared about. The pain you thought no one noticed. And when someone speaks to those hidden pieces, it creates a bond that logic struggles to undo. Soon you want to stay. You want to be around these people. You want to earn more of that love, that admiration, that belonging. Because now it's more than affection. It's identity. You begin to see yourself through their eyes, and that reflection becomes more vivid than the one you've always carried. But this love is rarely unconditional. The warmth that drew you in begins to hinge on your alignment, your agreement, your loyalty. If you start to question the message or the messenger, the warmth begins to cool. You'll notice fewer compliments, less eye contact, less laughter when you enter the room. The thing that once wrapped around you like a safety net now feels like a leash tugging gently at your decisions. You're not being punished, not overtly, but you feel it, a quiet withdrawal, a subtle reminder that your place here isn't quite as secure as it seemed. And that's the hook. Because when love becomes a currency, fear grows in its shadow, fear of being cast out, fear of going back to the cold, fear of losing what felt so perfect, so affirming, so rare. You might even start to blame yourself. Maybe you weren't grateful enough. Maybe you questioned too much. Maybe you forgot what it meant to be all in. And so, to win that love back, you bend a little more. Silence a few doubts. Nod when you're unsure. Smile when something doesn't sit right. The most powerful manipulations don't feel like force. They feel like family. And soon, you're not just chasing approval, you're shaping yourself to fit it. But deep down, a quiet whisper remains. A question, a flicker of unease you can't quite extinguish. And when it finally surfaces, it might cost you everything. When doubt feels like betrayal, at first, it's just a question. Small, harmless. A thought that rises quietly in the stillness of your own mind. Is this really true? You don't say it out loud. You don't even fully form it, but you feel it, the flicker. And in that moment, something shifts. Because here, in this carefully built world of belonging, doubt isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. You've been surrounded by certainty, by confident voices, by stories that align perfectly. The leader speaks with conviction. The group echoes it. There's no room for contradiction because everything has already been explained, wrapped neatly, tied up with meaning. And when something makes that unravel, even just a thread, it feels like treason. Not to them. To you. That's the trick. In the beginning, no one says doubt is betrayal. No one tells you to stop questioning. Not directly, but you start to notice things. A pause in someone's tone when you express hesitation. A glance exchanged across the room. A story about someone who doubted and was led astray. The language is gentle, but the message is clear. Questioning is the first step toward losing everything. And so you bury it. The doubt, the discomfort, the things that don't quite add up. You tuck them deep inside because what's at stake isn't just your opinion, it's your place, your belonging, your identity. The fear isn't only of being wrong, it's of being alone again. Eventually, you begin to silence yourself preemptively. You edit your thoughts before they even reach language. You learn which feelings are acceptable and which ones put you at risk. You start to confuse loyalty with silence, faith with obedience. In time, the group no longer needs to shame you. You do it yourself. You replay the moments you wavered. You tell yourself you were weak, that you let in the enemy, that you failed to trust. Doubt isn't just a crack in the story anymore, it's a stain on your character. And this, ironically, is how control deepens. Because once doubt feels like betrayal, the leader no longer needs to argue. The system no longer needs to punish. You've internalized the defense. You've built the prison from the inside. Every question becomes self-incrimination. Every hesitation, a reason to try harder to believe. And maybe that's the saddest part. You don't lose your freedom all at once. You give it up in fragments, in favors to belonging, in offerings to certainty, in the quiet surrender of your most honest thoughts. And still, sometimes in the dark, it comes back. That flicker, that small voice that remembers what it felt like to think freely. But it won't be welcomed. Not yet. Not here. Not until the rules change. And here, the first rule is simple. Never doubt the rules. The rule of absolute certainty. There's something comforting about being told the truth. No questions, no confusion, just clarity. A voice that sounds like it knows. A message that claims to see what others can't. At first, it feels like a relief. In a world full of gray, someone finally offers you black and white. No more searching, no more wondering, just answers. But not all clarity is earned, and not all certainty is safe. In groups that control through belief, certainty isn't just encouraged, it's demanded. The leader doesn't suggest ideas. They declare them with confidence, with conviction, and often with a story that explains everything. Every fear you've had, every struggle you've faced, every injustice you've seen, it all fits now. The message makes it make sense. And that feeling, that instant coherence, that's the hook. Because once something feels true, it takes root deeper than logic. And when a belief becomes your lens, everything you see starts to reflect it. Doubters look blind. Critics seem bitter. Facts that don't align must be part of the deception. The world outside becomes the enemy of your clarity. And so you hold on tighter. Not just to the belief, but to the feeling of being right. That's the real currency. The sense of superiority, of finally understanding what others can't. And as that belief is repeated by others in the group, by the leader, by you, it hardens. It stops feeling like a belief. It starts to feel like reality itself. That's when the rule sets in. Certainty is proof of your loyalty. Any sign of hesitation, it's treated as a weakness, a flaw, something to correct, not with open discussion, but with correction. You'll be reminded, re-explained, nudged back toward the right conclusion, until eventually you stop voicing your questions, not because they've disappeared, but because you've learned the cost of asking. Over time, this absolute certainty becomes the structure of your thinking. You stop entertaining other ideas, not because they don't exist, but because they don't deserve space. The rules define what's true, and truth becomes submission. There's no room for mystery, no room for ambiguity, no room for the parts of life that don't fit neatly into the story. And slowly, you start to forget that life ever had those parts at all. You stop exploring, you stop doubting, you stop growing. Because in this system, the truth isn't something to discover. It's something to obey. And the more you obey, the more the world narrows. Until finally, you're no longer navigating complexity. You're reciting certainty, not because it's true, but because it's what remains. But what happens when that certainty starts to trap you? When every exit you imagine leads back to the same answers? When the map you trusted suddenly folds in on itself? What do you call a truth that forbids escape? A world with no exit. At first, it feels expansive, a path to meaning, a new understanding. You're invited in with open arms and the promise that your life is about to change. And for a while, it does. You feel lighter, sharper, more connected. The questions that used to haunt you now seem distant. You've found your place. But over time, the walls begin to show. Not physical walls, of course. These are built from ideas, tight-knit logic loops, emotional anchors, social expectations. Slowly, the group's language becomes your language. The group's fears, your fears. The group's enemies, your enemies. You don't notice it right away, but alternatives begin to disappear. The books you read, the people you talk to, the media you consume, it all starts to align. Not by force, but by momentum, like a stream pulling you toward a familiar bend in the river. And then, one day you realize something strange. You can't imagine leaving. Not because you're forbidden, not explicitly, but because everything outside now feels hostile, confused, corrupt. You've been told that people who leave lose their way, that the outside world will never understand, that they'll mock, manipulate, or try to pull you back into ignorance. So you stay. Even if you feel restless, even if something doesn't quite sit right, you tell yourself you're just not ready, that the discomfort is yours to fix, not theirs, that the system can't be questioned because the system is truth. You look around, and the room is still warm, still familiar, but it no longer feels like home. It feels like the only place you're allowed to exist. That's how the trap is built. Not by locking the doors, but by erasing the exits. It's reinforced through fear cloaked as protection, through love that turns conditional, through answers that promise certainty and punish doubt. Every path that might lead out is framed as betrayal, failure, or madness. And so you stop walking. You convince yourself the problem is you, that you just need more time, more devotion, more belief, that if you stay long enough, the unease will pass, that if you try harder, you'll find the peace others seem to feel. But peace doesn't come from obedience. And meaning that can't survive scrutiny isn't meaning, it's containment. Still, the world outside remains a shadow, vague, threatening, unknown. And you've been told over and over, only they have the truth. Only they can guide you. Only they can protect you from the chaos you once came from. And if you leave, you'll be alone again. But sometimes, that thought being alone starts to feel less frightening than staying. And in the quiet moments, you wonder, if this is the truth, why does it fear the door? But here, doors aren't just locked. They're painted to look like walls. The Isolated Enlightened Few. It starts with a whisper. We see what others can't. A gentle suggestion that the world is asleep, and only you, only the group has truly awakened. At first, it sounds empowering. You feel chosen, not superior exactly, but special. Like you've cracked a code others don't even know exists. Soon that whisper becomes a framework. Every outsider is described the same way. Lost, blind, asleep, broken. They haven't woken up yet. They don't understand. But you do. And with that understanding comes something intoxicating, identity wrapped in exclusivity. You're no longer one among many. You're part of a few. The enlightened few. It's not always said directly. Often it's implied, wrapped in flattery, or woven into shared language. Words like truth seekers, awakened, or higher-minded surface again and again. The message is subtle, but constant. There are those who see the world as it truly is, and those who don't. And over time, this division becomes more than language. It becomes a boundary. You stop relating to others the same way. Conversations with outsiders feel hollow. You begin to anticipate their objections, their skepticism. You know what they'll say before they even say it. And worse, you start to see their disagreement not as difference, but as proof of their ignorance. The echo grows stronger. The group reinforces itself with stories of the blind masses, of institutions that suppress truth, of friends and family members who just don't get it. Every outsider's confusion becomes validation. Every critique becomes a badge of honor. And the circle tightens. Soon, the only voices that feel trustworthy are inside. Anyone who leaves the group is painted with pity or suspicion. They weren't ready. They let ego get in the way. they've fallen back asleep. These phrases aren't just defensive, they're protective. They maintain the illusion that you are still part of the chosen few. The isolation becomes self-sustaining. It feels like independence, but it's dependency wrapped in pride. You think you're seeing more, but in truth, you're seeing through a narrower lens, one shaped entirely by those who already agree. This is the paradox of the enlightened few. They speak of freedom, but limit what counts as truth. They praise awakening, but discourage exploration. They celebrate awareness, but only the kind that conforms. And over time, curiosity shrinks. Because if you already know, why search? If you already see, why look deeper? And if others can't understand you, maybe they were never worth listening to at all. But sometimes something breaks through. A comment from a stranger, a memory from before, a moment of stillness where the certainty wavers, and you catch a glimpse of the world outside the circle. For a second, it looks unfamiliar, but not because it's wrong, because it's real. And the voice that follows doesn't flatter. It simply asks, when did truth become something you could only share with people who already believe it? Thought-stopping phrases. You begin to express doubt, a question, a hesitation, a feeling that doesn't quite fit, and then as quickly as it came, it's shut down, not by argument, but by a phrase. Everything happens for a reason. You're just overthinking it. Stay in your higher self. Doubt is just fear in disguise. Trust the process. They're short, smooth, easy to remember, and that's exactly why they work. Thought-stopping phrases aren't about insight, they're about interruption. Their purpose isn't to help you think more clearly, it's to make you stop thinking altogether. In groups that rely on control, especially through belief, these phrases are deployed like verbal firewalls. The moment your mind begins to wander beyond the accepted frame, a familiar phrase is there to catch you, to block the path before it leads somewhere dangerous. At first they sound helpful, reassuring, like wisdom passed down from someone who knows more. And maybe they are, once. But repeated enough, used reflexively, they become something else entirely. They become the walls of your mental cage. You start using them on yourself, not just to silence others, but to silence your own unrest. The phrases loop in your head like mantras. And over time, the discomfort they're meant to soothe no longer even surfaces, because the thought doesn't get that far. It's interrupted, redirected, dissolved. And that's the trick. These aren't arguments you can debate. They're emotional shortcuts. They operate beneath logic, appealing to your longing for peace, for belonging, for certainty. You're not reasoning with them. You're obeying them. The damage is subtle, but deep. You lose the habit of questioning. You forget how to sit with discomfort. You become suspicious of nuance, and anything that doesn't resolve quickly, anything that asks for patience or depth, starts to feel threatening. Eventually, the phrases become part of your internal dialogue. You police your own thoughts with borrowed language. You use soft words to bury hard questions, and each time you do, you drift further from yourself. Because thought-stopping doesn't just keep out the bad, it blocks the real, the unfiltered, the part of you that wants to understand, not just comply. You start mistaking repetition for wisdom, simplicity for truth, calmness for clarity. But clarity doesn't always feel calm. Sometimes it rattles, sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it speaks with a voice that no group has approved. In a world of mantras, real thinking becomes rebellion, not with rage, not with noise, but with presence, with the willingness to ask a question and not rush to answer it. And that's the beginning of escape. But in spaces like these, questions rarely survive long because there's someone waiting to speak. Someone whose voice doesn't just calm the room, it silences it completely. A voice that doesn't need to argue. It only needs to sound sure. Charisma that commands. You feel it before you understand it. The room shifts when they speak. Eyes lock in. Conversations pause. A subtle silence ripples through the space. It's not what they say, it's how they say it. Every word lands with weight. Every pause feels deliberate. Every story leaves you wanting more. This is charisma, not charm, not likability, something deeper, more magnetic. The ability to make an idea feel like a revelation, to turn a sentence into a turning point, to speak as if the truth had finally chosen a voice. In groups that center around belief or ideology, charisma doesn't just attract, it binds. You're drawn in, not because you're weak, but because you're human. We are wired to respond to confidence, to rhythm, to presence, especially when it comes wrapped in emotional resonance. When someone can articulate the feelings you haven't yet found words for, it feels like they know you, like they see something you've only glimpsed in yourself. And once you believe that, they become more than a speaker. They become a guide. But charisma has a shadow. It can bypass the usual defenses, make you feel safe before you've had time to think. It creates a kind of cognitive shortcut. If they sound right, they must be right. The power of delivery begins to outshine the content itself. And when that happens, truth becomes inseparable from tone. Over time, disagreement feels not just uncomfortable, but disrespectful. You don't question them, because doing so feels like stepping out of harmony, like interrupting a melody with static. Their voice becomes the gravity around which the rest of the group orbits. And that orbit tightens. You start repeating their phrases, adopting their mannerisms, telling their stories like they're your own. It doesn't feel like mimicry. It feels like unity, like you're part of something bigger, something meaningful. But in that process, something quietly disappears. Your voice. Not all at once, just enough that you start measuring your thoughts by their potential reaction. You wonder before speaking if it aligns with what they would say. You begin to curate yourself, not because of pressure, but out of admiration. That's the hidden danger of charisma that commands. It doesn't need to demand control. It inspires surrender. And the more compelling the speaker, the harder it is to separate their skill from their substance. Some charismatic leaders believe what they say. Others simply enjoy the sway. But in both cases, the outcome can be the same. A room full of people nodding, not because they've understood, but because they've felt something they don't want to lose. That emotional resonance creates loyalty, and loyalty, when unexamined, becomes permission. To question less, to follow more, to hand over your reasoning in exchange for clarity that feels good. But clarity should never be confused with truth, especially when it's spoken so beautifully you forget to ask, does this actually make sense? Because when logic enters the stage draped in charisma, something subtle can happen. It starts to serve not truth, but persuasion. When logic becomes dangerous, it's easy to imagine manipulation as something emotional. Please, guilt, flattery. But some of the most powerful forms wear a colder face. They sound precise, rational, clean, and when used skillfully, logic becomes more than a tool for thinking. It becomes a weapon for control. In tightly structured groups, especially cults or high-demand ideologies, logic is often treated as sacred. It's what separates them from the irrational world. Every belief is reinforced with internal coherence. Every question has an answer, and if you follow the reasoning, you always end up in the same place. It feels safe, elegant. But here's the trap. Just because something is internally consistent doesn't mean it's true. A system can be perfectly logical within itself, but built on faulty assumptions. And once those assumptions go unquestioned, the logic becomes airtight, and airtight can suffocate. You hear arguments that sound irrefutable. If the leader is enlightened, then their guidance must be correct. If you're doubting, then you're resisting the truth. If you resist the truth, then you're not ready. Therefore, your doubt proves your weakness. It makes sense, but only if you've already accepted the premise, and that's the sleight of hand. Dangerous logic isn't sloppy, it's circular. It uses its own conclusions as evidence. It reframes opposition as confirmation. It pre-defends itself from all criticism by folding every counterpoint into its structure. You don't notice it at first. You're too impressed by how neatly everything fits. But over time, you begin to feel a kind of mental stiffness, a fear of exploring too far in any direction. Not because you're being told not to, but because every path that leads away has already been mapped as wrong. You start to doubt your own thinking. If something doesn't make sense to you, you assume the flaw is yours. You're not enlightened enough, not ready, not capable of grasping the higher logic. And so you study harder, trust deeper, surrender further, hoping that one day it will click. But sometimes it doesn't. And instead of freedom, you find yourself in a prison made of reason. This is how logic becomes dangerous, not by being false, but by being unchallengeable. It punishes ambiguity, dismisses emotional truths, frames moral discomfort as intellectual weakness, and when used in the service of control, it makes obedience feel like intelligence. You're not just agreeing, you're getting it. You're not just complying, you're seeing the bigger picture. And that's where it sinks deepest. Because once logic becomes the proof of your belonging, it stops being a path to truth. It becomes a test. And failing that test means losing your place, your certainty, your identity. But real logic has space for uncertainty, for contradictions, for uncomfortable truths that don't resolve neatly. And sometimes, the most reasonable thing you can do is question the reason itself. Still, not every system relies on logic alone. Some speak directly to the body, to rhythm, to repetition. They don't just convince you, they shape you. And they do it without a single word. Rituals that reshape you. You're not told who to be, not directly. No one comes with a script and orders you to recite it. Instead, you're invited, step by step, gesture by gesture, into a rhythm that feels ancient, purposeful, almost sacred. It starts with small routines, group chants, shared meals, timed silences, movements performed together. Maybe you don't understand the meaning at first, but you don't need to. What matters is the feeling, the unity, the calm. Ritual doesn't demand belief. It creates it. In groups that rely on control, rituals are more than tradition. They're transformation. Each act you repeat, each posture you assume, begins to reshape how you see the world and how you see yourself within it. Over time, you stop asking why. The ritual becomes the answer. And not just intellectually, physically. Your body begins to associate certain gestures with belonging, certain songs with safety, certain postures with peace. The repeated patterns carve grooves into your nervous system. They anchor your emotions. They tell your brain, this is what we do. This is who we are. That's the power of embodied belief. You're not just thinking something, you're living it, moving it, breathing it into your muscles. This is why rituals are so effective, not because of what they say, but because of what they replace. They fill silence with structure, doubt with repetition. They quiet the chaos of thought by giving your hands something to do. And when done in a group, that effect multiplies. You look around and see others kneeling, bowing, chanting, holding still, and you mirror them, not out of pressure, but instinct. We are creatures of imitation. When surrounded by a synchronized group, we want to stay in step. It feels wrong to break the rhythm. Even if a part of you is unsure, your body doesn't wait for certainty. It moves, and with enough repetition, that movement becomes meaning. You begin to feel guilty if you miss a step. You worry you're not doing it right. You internalize the idea that how well you perform the ritual reflects how committed you are, and that opens the door to self-surveillance. You begin to monitor your own sincerity. Am I doing this with the right spirit? Am I pure enough inside to deserve the peace I feel? Over time, the ritual no longer just signals belief. It becomes the evidence of it. You're not allowed to feel lost, confused, or different. The ritual has already decided what your body should express, and if your body is in line, the assumption is that your heart must be too. But there's danger in that alignment. When rituals take over reflection, when form becomes more important than freedom, they stop being practices of meaning and start becoming habits of submission. Because you're no longer engaging, you're performing. And you might not even notice it's happening. Until one day you hesitate, just a beat, just long enough to realize you're going through motions you didn't choose, and that tiny gap between movement and meaning, between reflex and intention, becomes a crack in the structure. A space where the question slips in. If my body is repeating something again and again, is it still my choice? That question, left unanswered, begins to pull on everything. The illusion of free will. You look back and feel like you made the choice. You joined because it felt right. You stayed because it made sense. No one forced you. No one dragged you in. And yet, somewhere along the way, you realize you've stopped choosing at all. Free will is a comforting idea. We like to think we are the authors of our lives, that every decision we make is ours alone. But under certain conditions, especially within manipulative groups or controlling systems, what feels like freedom is often just carefully shaped influence. You're given options, but only one feels right. You're asked questions, but only one answer is safe. You're told you're free to leave, but reminded of what that would mean, that you're abandoning the truth, betraying something sacred, walking away from people who love you. The control doesn't look like chains. It looks like loyalty. When someone else defines what's good, what's moral, what's enlightened, your decisions start orbiting their approval, and slowly the boundary between your thoughts and theirs begins to blur. You repeat ideas you didn't originate. You suppress doubts before they fully form. You feel pride for obedience and shame for divergence. And still it all feels like your own doing. This is how the illusion works. Not by forcing you to obey, but by shaping your environment so thoroughly that any other path becomes invisible. You start to believe you've changed your mind, when really, the space to think differently was never there to begin with. The people around you reflect back the same beliefs. The stories you hear are filtered through a shared lens, and anything outside that frame is dismissed as ignorance, fear, or evil. So you stay, you deepen, you believe. And from the outside, it looks like choice. But inside, the range of what's thinkable has been slowly narrowed. This is not mind control in the dramatic sense. There are no wires in your head, just expectations, repetition, social reinforcement, and emotional manipulation. Small tools, subtle tools. But over time, they can make the difference between a person thinking freely and a person who simply thinks they do. The scariest part is how easy it is to believe you're still independent. You can leave whenever you want. You just don't want to. You can question anything. You just don't feel the need. You can say no, but something inside tells you not to. And that something isn't instinct. It's training, delivered slowly, layered over days, weeks, months, until it no longer feels foreign, it feels natural. You mistake comfort for truth, familiarity for correctness, surrender for clarity. But the moment you realize that the options were never really yours, that the framework itself was designed to limit you, a different kind of discomfort sets in. Not the doubt of being wrong, but the fear that your will was never fully yours. That your thoughts were led, your desires directed, your silence chosen, but only because speaking would cost you everything. And sometimes, to maintain the illusion of freedom, you're asked to prove it, to stand up and explain, in your own words, why you believe, why you're committed, why you're still here. But when your voice is shaped by pressure, is that still a confession? Or is it something else entirely? Forced confessions. There's a moment when silence becomes more dangerous than speech, when you're not just expected to believe, but to declare out loud, in front of others, with sincerity, clarity, and conviction. It's no longer enough to comply quietly. Now you must confess. In many manipulative groups, confessions aren't about truth, they're about control. You're asked to admit your doubts, your wrongdoings, your impure thoughts, not for the sake of healing, but for reinforcement. Public confession becomes a tool to break resistance and rewire allegiance. The process is subtle at first. It might begin with a group session where everyone shares something personal. It seems harmless, an invitation to vulnerability. But beneath that surface lies something more calculated. As others begin to open up, you feel pressure to do the same. Not participating feels like defiance. Being quiet marks you as distant, suspicious, maybe even dishonest. Eventually, the moment comes when you speak. You say what they expect. You admit something small, a hesitation, a fleeting doubt. And they listen with nods, perhaps even praise you for your honesty. But then they dig deeper. What else did you feel? What else did you think? And slowly you're led further in until the confession becomes less about what happened and more about what should have happened. You begin to narrate your experience through their lens. You reshape your story to fit the group's beliefs. You stop describing what you felt and start describing what they want you to feel. It doesn't matter if it's accurate. What matters is that it aligns. This kind of confession isn't cleansing. It's a performance. One where the goal is to demonstrate your loyalty, your awareness of your failings, your willingness to change. And the more convincingly you deliver it, the more you're rewarded. You're seen as brave, self-aware, evolving. But the real transformation isn't in what you say, it's in what it costs to say it. Each time you confess, you surrender a little more of your private self. Each admission chips away at your boundaries. You learn that your innermost thoughts are not fully yours, that they can be asked for, examined, and judged. Over time, you begin to anticipate the process. You scan your mind for errors before anyone else can. You become both the prisoner and the warden. Eventually, confession becomes routine, expected, and those who hesitate are met with suspicion. Why aren't they opening up? What are they hiding? In this environment, silence becomes its own kind of guilt. Some groups even turn confession into ritual. Weekly admissions, public recitations, testimonies of former doubts crushed by new insight. The content may vary, but the purpose stays the same, to keep members aligned, obedient, and emotionally exposed. This is not about justice. It's not about accountability. It's about creating a system where your identity depends on constant self-surveillance, where your moral standing is always provisional, dependent on how convincingly you denounce your former self. And most chillingly, over time, you start to forget which parts were true and which were shaped by expectation. You remember the confession better than the experience. Because once truth becomes something that must be declared, edited, and approved, it starts to slip from your grasp. And what replaces it is something else entirely, something repeated so often by so many voices that you start to believe it not because it's true, but because it's been repeated enough times to sound like it is. Truth by repetition. At first it sounds ridiculous, as if hearing something more often could somehow make it more real. But over time, you begin to notice its effect, not because you believe immediately, but because the edges of your doubt start to wear down. In a controlled group, repetition is not laziness. It's strategy. Certain phrases echo in teachings, in conversations, in rituals. Core ideas are spoken in every meeting, woven into every story, slipped casually into daily language. The same concepts surface again and again, not to inform, but to implant. Repetition changes how the brain evaluates truth. Psychologists call it the illusory truth effect, a cognitive bias where repeated statements feel more believable, even when we know they're false. The mind doesn't store facts in isolation. It registers familiarity as a marker of credibility. If you've heard it before, your guard is lowered the next time. Eventually, you stop analyzing and start absorbing. This is especially powerful in high-control environments, where outside voices are silenced, when dissent is labeled dangerous, When questioning is seen as weakness, without competing narratives, repetition doesn't just reinforce ideas, it replaces alternatives. Suddenly, slogans become convictions. Oversimplifications become sacred truths. You start hearing the same sentence in different voices from different people in different moments. A leader speaks it during a teaching. A peer says it over lunch. You say it to yourself, quietly, when things don't make sense. And with each repetition, its emotional resonance deepens. It becomes more than belief. It becomes rhythm. You might begin to sense the circular logic in it all, but pointing it out feels disloyal. After all, if everyone says it and everyone believes it, maybe you're the one who's missing something. That creeping doubt becomes internalized shame. So you repeat it again, just in case, just to stay safe. And soon enough, the line between remembering and repeating disappears. You forget why the phrase mattered in the first place. You stop asking whether it's accurate. What matters is that it's yours now, or at least it feels that way. The most effective repeated truths are the ones that sound profound without saying much. We are the chosen. There is no truth outside. This is the only way. Phrases like these aren't meant to spark reflection. They're meant to end it. They quiet your search for meaning by giving you a shortcut. And once you internalize that shortcut, something shifts. You hear someone else challenge the group's belief, and before you even think, the phrase surfaces. You repeat it automatically, like a reflex, not because it convinces them, but because it protects you. It shields you from the discomfort of uncertainty. It reaffirms your place. It proves you belong. But belonging through repetition is fragile because it requires constant maintenance. You must speak the lines often enough to stay in tune with the group, but not so mechanically that others notice your doubt. You must believe, visibly, audibly, reliably. And in that performance, something subtle happens. You begin to wonder whether you believe it because it's true or just because it's been said enough times to feel like it must be. You consider breaking the pattern, but then you remember what silence costs, what skepticism signals. And you say it again. One more time. Because in spaces like these, the loudest truth isn't the one that makes sense. It's the one that never stops being said. Secrets that bind you. There's a moment when someone pulls you aside and shares something that feels sacred, a hidden truth, a confession, a piece of themselves no one else knows. The air gets quiet. You feel chosen, trusted, important. That moment becomes a hinge. Before it, you were an outsider. After it, you are part of something deeper. In high-control groups, secrets aren't just private. They're currency. They're exchanged, hoarded, used. A leader might reveal a hidden teaching meant only for the ready. A peer might share their trauma, their guilt, their doubts. You might be asked to share something yourself. Not publicly at first, just enough to create a bond. These secrets feel like intimacy. They create closeness because holding someone's truth is powerful. But over time, you begin to see how this intimacy is not always mutual. You've shared your fears, your mistakes, your vulnerabilities. And now, those pieces of you are woven into the fabric of the group. This isn't transparency, it's leverage. You learn, slowly, that secrecy maintains the hierarchy, that not everyone knows what you know, that truth is revealed in layers based on loyalty. The group becomes a labyrinth of half-knowns and carefully timed revelations. You can't speak freely because someone else might not be ready. You don't ask too much because that might signal impatience or doubt. The secrets you carry are not just yours. You are now responsible for other people's shame, other people's trauma, other people's stories. And with that responsibility comes silence. The kind that keeps things in order, the kind that prevents disruption. And when you do speak, it's often under guidance. You're told when to confess, what to admit, how to frame it. There's a story to maintain, and your secret becomes part of the script. You start to feel the weight of what you know, the burden of what you've said. The quiet understanding that some doors once opened can't be closed. Eventually, the group knows you too well. Not just your name or your habits, but your fears, your doubts, your history, the things that shaped you before you arrived, the things you swore you'd never say out loud. They've been witnessed, cataloged, remembered. This isn't connection, it's containment. You may feel that leaving is impossible, not because you're locked in, but because too much of you is already here. The idea of walking away doesn't just mean changing your mind. It means severing yourself from a version of you that only exists inside this space. And worse, it means risking what happens if those secrets aren't kept sacred anymore. You remember the stories, people who left and were exposed, their confessions retold, their names tarnished. It's not just social pressure, it's existential. Who are you outside this web of shared knowing? Who are you if everything you regret is no longer safe? And so you stay. Not always because you believe, but because you've been woven in, bound not by chains or threats, but by memories, some of which aren't even yours anymore. You carry the group's story inside you, and they carry yours. Leaving would mean untangling all of it. And by now, you're not sure where your truth ends and theirs begins. But even deeper than that, something else keeps you anchored, something harder to name, harder to resist. And it begins to whisper that you owe something, that your doubts are a betrayal, that your exit would be an abandonment, not of the group, but of the people you love. And that's where guilt finds its voice. Guilt as a weapon. Guilt has a unique sting. Unlike fear, it doesn't shout. It whispers, it seeps in slowly and makes you question not what you've done, but who you are. In a manipulative system, guilt becomes more than an emotion. It becomes a tool, not to foster growth, but to control behavior. At first, it looks like accountability. You're encouraged to examine your flaws, your resistance, your lack of commitment. You're asked to reflect on how your actions affect others, how your doubts slow the group's progress. It sounds noble, like maturity. But as time passes, you start to realize the guilt you feel isn't just about your mistakes. It's about your identity being quietly rewritten to match the group's ideals. You start to apologize for your thoughts. Not just what you said, but what you didn't say. Not just what you did, but what you felt. You're told that hesitation is selfish, that questioning is evidence of a corrupted heart, that full devotion means more than compliance. It means emotional purity. In this world, guilt isn't the result of wrongdoing. It's the result of deviation. You begin to watch yourself constantly. Was that a selfish impulse? Did you serve enough today? Were your intentions pure? Guilt becomes the lens through which you monitor your own mind. And once it takes root, it doesn't need to be enforced from the outside anymore. You carry it within you. You start policing yourself better than anyone else ever could. This self-surveillance is praised. You're told it's growth. That self-criticism is the path to enlightenment. That discomfort is the evidence of progress. And if you begin to feel overwhelmed, you're told to confess more, to purge your doubts, to dig deeper, to search for hidden impurities. The solution is always more submission. But here's the catch. The guilt never ends. No matter how much you give, there's always more to surrender. The standards shift. What was acceptable yesterday is now a sign of weakness. And because you've already admitted so much, because you've accepted that you're flawed, selfish, impure, it becomes harder to argue. Your past confessions become ammunition. You can't protest the judgment when you've already accepted the crime. And so, you keep trying to be better. You follow the rules, you work harder, you serve more eagerly, but the guilt doesn't fade. Because in systems like these, guilt isn't meant to be resolved. It's meant to linger, to motivate, to trap. Worse, the guilt gets personalized. You're not just letting down a leader or a doctrine, you're letting down your community, your family, the people who say they love you. Disagreement becomes betrayal. discomfort becomes evidence of your failure to evolve. And when you feel the urge to leave, that guilt sharpens into shame. Not for leaving, but for even considering it. By then, it's no longer about beliefs or logic. You stay because guilt tells you you're not ready to go, that you haven't earned the right, that you're too broken, too selfish, too far from being who you're supposed to be. And the only way forward, you're told, is to stay. To trust the process, to lean in harder, to surrender more. And so you do. Until the guilt isn't just something you carry, it becomes the reason you no longer recognize yourself. But in groups like these, guilt is never the end game. It's just the middle. Because once you've been cracked open, once your sense of self has eroded, they offer something new in its place. A clean slate, a fresh identity. A version of you, they say, is better than who you were. And the process begins again, but this time, under the guise of rebirth. Break you, then rebuild you. Every group has a story about transformation. They speak of becoming new, being born again, finding your true self. But in coercive systems, transformation doesn't begin with discovery. It begins with destruction. You're not guided to become something more. You're told that who you are is the problem. It starts subtly. You're praised for your potential, but warned about your ego. You're told your past was shaped by lies, distractions, and conditioning. Your instincts, your reasoning, your memories, they're all suspect. You're invited to question everything you've believed up to now, especially the parts that once made you feel grounded. Then, the push comes harder. Flaws are spotlighted. Private confessions are reinterpreted as deep character defects. You're made to revisit your shame until you stop defending yourself. The group applauds when you break down, when you admit weakness, when you cry and say you never really knew who you were. That's the moment they consider you ready. Because now, you've been emptied. It's not about facts, it's about identity. Your sense of self is chipped away through guilt, isolation, and repeated messages that your independence is the enemy. That the person you were before this, whoever you thought that was blind, broken, asleep. And then, once you've stopped resisting, the rebuild begins. You're given new language, new rituals, a new purpose. You start using phrases you once found strange. You begin policing the thoughts you used to allow. You feel proud when you catch yourself slipping and correct it fast. That self-correction is praised. It's called awareness, growth, loyalty. People around you mirror this change. They welcome the new you. They say you're finally becoming authentic, but you notice something else too. The group's version of authentic looks eerily similar on everyone. Same expressions, same beliefs, same carefully managed emotions. It feels harmonious, but not free. And yet, freedom isn't what you're told to want. You're told you've been liberated. That letting go of the old you is what healing looks like. That surrender is strength. This new identity is praised, but it's also fragile. It depends on continual reinforcement. You need the group's approval to feel stable, their correction to stay on track. You begin to rely on the structure, not just for guidance, but for selfhood. Without it, you feel uncertain, exposed. The irony is sharp. The person you were was called lost, but the person you are now can't exist without the group. You've traded confusion for certainty, but it's a certainty scripted for you, not discovered by you. And so you stay close. You nod in agreement. You speak the doctrine fluently. You guide others through the same path, because part of the rebuild is responsibility. Once you're stable enough, you're expected to help shape someone else. The cycle continues, breaking, rebuilding, breaking again. And beneath it all is the subtle warning. Don't fall back, don't question, don't return to who you were. Because once your identity has been replaced, doubt feels like treason, and those who doubt are cast not as lost, but as threats. That's when a new boundary appears, quiet and absolute. The world splits in two, those who belong and those who never will. Us versus them psychology. One of the most powerful manipulations doesn't involve changing your beliefs, it changes your boundaries. It draws a new line in your mind, one that divides the world into two camps, those who see the truth and those who never will. It begins with subtle language. Terms like outsiders, the unawakened, the world, or the lost start to appear more often. People who disagree with the group aren't just wrong, they're blind. If they criticize the group, they're not raising valid concerns. They're attacking what's good, what's pure. And if they leave the group, they didn't just walk away, they betrayed something sacred. Inside this mindset, doubt doesn't become a sign of critical thinking. It becomes evidence that you're drifting toward them. Loyalty isn't about actions, it's about emotional alignment. You're asked to question anyone who challenges the group, not just intellectually, but morally. This shift creates a new kind of fear, not of punishment, but of disconnection. You start to feel that questioning the group might separate you from the people you care about. And more than that, you begin to internalize that people outside the group don't understand you anymore, that they can't, that their concern is rooted in ignorance. What forms is not just a group, but a fortress. It's no longer about ideas, it's about identity. And that identity is defined in contrast to the outside world. You're told that your sacrifices make you special, that outsiders live shallow, chaotic, meaningless lives. You're part of something deeper, wiser, more evolved. And that creates a rush of belonging, but also a hidden arrogance. It feels like safety, but it's a wall. The most dangerous part of us versus them thinking is that it replaces dialogue with suspicion. If someone disagrees, you no longer ask why, they're just part of the problem. If someone raises a critique, it's not a point to consider, it's a threat to contain. You begin to filter everything through the lens of loyalty, even your own thoughts. If you feel discomfort, you're told to reflect on your devotion. If you question a teaching, you're told to examine your heart. The possibility that the group might be wrong is erased, because the group is now framed as your only path to truth. To question it is to endanger yourself. You begin to see how language gets weaponized. Terms like spiritual warfare, false teachings, or energy vampires aren't just metaphors. They become tools for distancing and division. And once that wedge is in place, the group no longer needs to silence dissent. You do it yourself. You stop reaching out to old friends. You interpret family concern as hostility. You see warning signs from others as jealousy, resistance, or fear. And in doing so, you cut off the last threads that might have pulled you out. This binary world becomes so familiar, so comforting in its clarity, that you forget complexity ever existed. But underneath the loyalty is something else entirely. A quiet fear that if you ever recross that line, you wouldn't know who you are anymore. And so, you stay on this side. Because here, the world makes sense. Here, you're surrounded by people who agree. And here, there's someone at the center who says they see it all clearly. Someone who never doubts, never wavers, never fails. And once you've accepted the divide, that person isn't just a guide anymore. They become the source of what's real. The infallible leader. In the beginning, they might seem almost ordinary, warm, attentive, humble. They tell stories about their struggles, their path to awakening, their mistakes. That vulnerability draws you in. It makes them relatable, human. But slowly, something shifts. Their insights always land just right. Their predictions start to feel prophetic. Their interpretations become the only ones that truly make sense. And when disagreements arise, when someone challenges their authority, their calm turns sharp. You notice the way critics are framed, not as honest dissenters, but as dangerous, disloyal, or spiritually diseased. What unfolds is not declared outright. It doesn't need to be. No one says, this person is infallible, but you begin to notice how everyone speaks about them. Always with reverence. Always with gratitude. Their words are quoted like scripture. Their opinions are repeated like truths. Their presence is described as grounding, even divine. Mistakes, when they happen, are reframed as lessons. If they act harshly, it's because you needed tough love. If they contradict themselves, it's because your understanding is limited. If they lash out, it's your energy that triggered them. Over time, they no longer have to demand obedience. They just speak, and the group adapts. You adapt, not out of fear, but out of admiration. Or at least, that's what it feels like. But there's a hidden tension beneath that admiration. Because if the leader is always right, then where does that leave your own instincts? If their perspective is always higher, then yours must always be lower. You begin to suppress the flickers of doubt, the subtle discomfort, the questions that don't quite go away. You remind yourself that they've led you this far, that they've seen things you haven't, that it's you, not them, who still needs to grow. This creates a strange dependence. You start looking to them for not just guidance, but permission to act, to feel, to believe. You might wait for their validation before making a life decision, even if they never asked you to. You start interpreting events through the lens they've offered. A hardship isn't random. It's a test they prepared you for. A success isn't yours alone. It's a reflection of their wisdom. In this world, the leader isn't just a person. They become a mirror of who you wish to be and a guardian against who you fear becoming. Questioning them doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels disloyal, dangerous, even blasphemous. And so you learn to adjust your thoughts before they ever reach the surface. Because if they're always right, then your doubt must always be wrong. This doesn't require harsh enforcement. In fact, it's maintained through subtle warmth, through phrases like trust the process. Don't let your ego speak, or stay humble. These reminders are rarely aggressive, but they're constant. And their message is clear. Truth doesn't come from inside you, it comes through them. At first, this might feel like safety, like you found someone who finally sees the world with clarity. But slowly, it becomes harder to tell where their voice ends and your own begins. And when your inner voice starts to sound like theirs, you stop noticing that it used to be different. Watching the inner life, it's one thing to monitor behavior, to notice what someone says, how they act, where they go. But the deeper control begins when what's being watched isn't just your outer world, it's your thoughts. In many groups, introspection is encouraged. You're told to reflect, to become more aware, to confront your ego. At first, this feels empowering. You're learning to observe yourself, to recognize patterns, but gradually, that self-reflection becomes something else. It becomes surveillance. You're not just encouraged to notice your inner life, you're asked to report it. You share your doubts, your impulses, your resistance, not because you want to, but because you've been taught that honesty is the path to growth, that transparency is the cure for deception, that hiding your thoughts means you're hiding from truth. So you begin to confess things you never would have said before. A flicker of doubt, a critical thought, a moment of selfishness. And each time you do, the group nods in support. You're praised for being open, for catching your shadows, for growing. It feels cleansing. It feels virtuous. Until it doesn't. Because the more you confess, the more you realize there's no clear line between being honest and being obedient. Certain thoughts raise concern. Certain feelings spark suspicion. You start to learn which parts of yourself are acceptable and which are signs of regression. And then, the next shift begins. You start to monitor yourself in advance. Before the thoughts even reach full form, you ask whether they're pure, whether they align with the group's teaching, whether you'll have to explain them later. You begin editing your inner life before it can become outer life. Your mind becomes a courtroom, always mid-trial, always under review. This isn't forced. No one is shouting, but it's constant. Every time you hear a phrase like stay vigilant, guard your mind, or watch the ego, it reinforces the same message. Your inner world is a battleground, and if you're not on guard, the enemy will win. But what's the enemy? Often it's nothing more than a question, a hesitation, a feeling of unease when something doesn't sit right. These aren't framed as natural or healthy. They're framed as signs of corruption, disconnection, rebellion. And that framing turns your own awareness against you. You start to fear your own reactions, not because they're dangerous, but because they might be disapproved of. You stop exploring certain thoughts, not because they're untrue, but because they're unsafe to hold. And eventually, the most dangerous idea of all starts to take root. That your thoughts are not really yours. That your mind belongs to something bigger now. And once that idea settles in, you begin to offer up your silence as proof of alignment. You stop resisting. You stay quiet. You smile when you're supposed to. You nod when expected. And on the surface, you seem peaceful. But inside, something's changed. Not because you've found peace, but because you've learned to hide from yourself. And when your own mind no longer feels like home, language becomes something else entirely, not a tool for truth, but a device to reshape it. Words that twist reality. Language is how we make sense of the world. It names what we feel, defines what we see, and draws lines between truth and illusion. But in the wrong hands, words become more than explanations. They become instruments of distortion. In many high-control environments, language shifts subtly at first. Terms you thought you knew take on new meanings. Love becomes obedience. Freedom becomes submission. Growth means aligning with the group's teachings. It feels like poetry, but it functions like a spell, reshaping your perception without your realizing it. Take a simple phrase like negative energy. It sounds harmless, even spiritual. But in the group's vocabulary, it becomes a catch-all for disagreement, discomfort, even grief. If you question something, you're told you're in a low vibration. If you're anxious, it's not because something's wrong, it's because you're out of alignment. And if you're critical, you're being triggered in your ego, or worse, infected by doubt. These phrases close the door before the conversation can even begin. They give the illusion of insight while cutting off real reflection. If everything you feel can be rebranded as a weakness, a flaw, a resistance, then nothing you feel is valid unless it serves the group. Over time, you internalize these definitions. You start using their words without realizing their impact. You describe your hesitations as blocks, your skepticism as limiting beliefs. You stop calling things what they are. A lie becomes a deeper truth you're not ready for. A contradiction becomes a paradox to surrender to. Abuse becomes a challenge sent to humble you. And once language becomes this flexible, reality does too. You no longer trust your first reaction. If something feels off, you look for the spiritual explanation. If someone hurts you, you wonder what lesson you were meant to learn. If you see manipulation, you doubt your own clarity. This isn't just about vocabulary, it's about disorientation. Because when words no longer mean what they used to, your inner compass starts to spin. And in that confusion, the only stable reference point becomes the group's interpretation. Their words define the frame. Their phrases become the logic. Their labels turn complex experiences into manageable boxes. But those boxes are not neutral. They direct your attention, shape your emotions, and most dangerously, they teach you which parts of your experience are worthy of reflection and which should be dismissed outright. You begin to speak a different language, not just in conversation, but in your head. You filter your thoughts before you think them. You rehearse your words before you speak them. You reach for phrases not because they reflect your truth, but because they won't raise suspicion. And the more fluent you become in their language, the further you drift from your own. At some point, you might forget what your original words sounded like. You might forget what doubt once felt like, before it had a label. You might forget what you believed, before belief was something given, not chosen. And when that moment comes, you won't need anyone watching over you anymore. Because the voice that censors you won't be theirs. It'll be your own. Policing your own thoughts. It starts as a kind of mindfulness. You're told to become aware of your inner dialogue. to monitor your ego, to catch the thoughts that don't serve your growth. At first, it feels like a path to clarity, a way to become better, purer, more in tune with the truth. But soon, that awareness becomes hyper-vigilance. You're no longer noticing thoughts, you're interrogating them. You start to scan your mind for anything that might signal doubt, resistance, pride, or disconnection from the group's ideals. A quiet questioning voice, dangerous. A moment of irritation, that's your ego. A memory that doesn't align with the group's story. It must be false, or at least misguided. You don't need someone else to silence you anymore. You've learned to do it yourself. It isn't punishment, it's discipline. That's how it's framed. You're praised for catching yourself, for correcting your mental patterns, for choosing better thoughts. You feel proud when you suppress the questions, when you redirect the confusion, when you surrender the part of you that used to think differently. You believe you're improving. But beneath that progress is something quieter. Fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of falling out of alignment. Fear of what it means if the voice in your head keeps whispering things you were told are untrue. So you respond the way you were trained to. You replace the thought. You repeat the mantra. You tell yourself that discomfort is resistance, that unease is growth, that any voice pulling you away from the group's message is a trick of your lower self. And just like that, thinking becomes disloyalty. You notice how others in the group do it too, how they speak in rehearsed phrases, how they nod along to every teaching, how no one ever seems to say, "I'm not sure," how every expression of doubt is immediately reframed as an opportunity to surrender more deeply. The culture doesn't demand silence, it demands agreement, and that pressure is never louder than when it comes from inside your own head. Over time, the boundaries between your thoughts and the group's beliefs blur. You stop being able to tell where your voice ends and theirs begins. Your mind feels less like a sanctuary and more like a stage, one where every thought must be performed for the approval of an invisible audience. And what happens when a forbidden thought refuses to leave? You bury it deeper. You call it weakness. You assign it shame. You wrap it in guilt and pretend it never arrived. Until one day, your silence feels like wisdom. Your obedience feels like strength. Your fear feels like humility. And you begin to mistake your repression for peace. The group no longer needs to monitor you. They don't have to correct you or confront you. Because every time a forbidden thought arises, you're already there, waiting to erase it. It's not that you've lost your ability to think freely. It's that you've trained yourself not to want it. And in that training, something else quietly takes hold, the belief that struggle itself is the path to worthiness. That suffering isn't just necessary, it's sacred. Purity through suffering. There's a moment in many high-control environments when pain becomes the proof. Not the proof of abuse or dysfunction or imbalance, but of growth, of transformation, of purification. You're told that your discomfort is a sign the process is working, that if it doesn't hurt, you're not doing it right. That suffering isn't just the cost of progress. It is progress. And so you endure. You endure long hours of silence, endless repetition, intense rituals, confessions that leave you raw and exposed. You endure sleep deprivation, emotional breakdowns, and the slow erosion of personal boundaries, and you're praised for it. Not with money or comfort or safety, but with meaning. You're becoming better, cleaner, closer to the truth. Doubt, that's your impurity leaving the system. Grief, that's your ego dying. Confusion, that means your old mind is breaking open to receive a higher wisdom. You learn to read your own pain as proof that you're on the right path, that the more it hurts, the deeper it goes. That every shiver of resistance is a dragon being slain inside you. And this framing is powerful because it takes what should be a red flag and makes it a green light. You don't question the pain, you lean into it, you seek it out. Because in this world, ease is suspect, joy is fleeting, comfort is indulgence. The real transformation happens when you're brought to your knees. When you cry and shake and crumble, when you're told, "Good, let it break you." And in those moments, the line between healing and harm disappears. You might begin to believe that your value is measured by how much you can endure, that the more you give up, the more you're worth, that the deeper the wound, the greater the transformation. So you offer more: your time, your privacy, your relationships, your sense of self. And when it still isn't enough, you dig deeper. Because the purity always seems just out of reach. Every failure becomes fuel. Every setback is framed as a test. And soon you no longer ask whether this is right. You only ask how much more you need to give. You stop looking for relief. You stop expecting rest. You convince yourself that freedom comes only after you've been broken completely, and anything less than total surrender is resistance. This is how the cycle continues. The more pain you feel, the more noble your journey appears. The more you suffer, the more pure you must be becoming. And the more you begin to believe that those who walk away are weak, shallow, unwilling to go deep enough. Because leaving in a world built on suffering doesn't just look like quitting. It feels like betrayal. Or worse, sin. Leaving feels like sin. It should be simple. If something no longer feels right, you walk away. If the weight becomes too much, you lay it down. If a place once promised light but now feels like a cage, you find the exit. But in high-control environments, leaving doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like betrayal. Not just of the group, or the teachings, or the leader, but of yourself. Because over time, you've been taught that this path isn't just one way of living, it's the way, the only way, the higher truth, the sacred mission, the ultimate purpose. And to turn your back on that feels like turning your back on meaning itself. So you don't think, "This isn't working for me." You think, "I must be failing." You replay your doubts like confessions. Maybe you weren't ready. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe your ego got in the way. You've been taught that confusion is a test, that discomfort is resistance, that the only way out is through. So you stay. You stay longer than you should. And every time your instinct whispers, "Leave," the group offers a louder answer, "Grow." They remind you how far you've come. They frame your hesitation as fear. They hold up stories of others who left and fell into darkness, lost their purpose, or became enemies of truth. You don't want to become that story. You don't want to be the one who couldn't handle it. So you bury the impulse. You silence the questions. You smile and nod and keep doing the work. Even when your body feels tired. Even when your voice feels small. Even when your mind feels like it's collapsing in on itself. Because in this framework, leaving isn't neutral. It's failure. It's weakness. It's proof that the darkness won. And the guilt runs deep. You remember the promises, the ones they made and the ones you made to yourself, that this would be your transformation, your rebirth, your answer. You don't just feel like you're walking away from a group. You feel like you're abandoning a version of yourself you were supposed to become. So instead of opening the door, you lock it tighter. You try harder. You recommit. You push the doubt further down. You repeat the mantras. You convince yourself the ache is just part of the process, that if you keep going, eventually the feeling will pass. But it doesn't pass. It lingers, quiet, constant, waiting. And eventually you realize something difficult. The pain of staying has become heavier than the fear of leaving. That doesn't make it easy, but it makes it possible. And if you do go, if you finally step away, it won't feel like freedom at first. It will feel like shame, like guilt, like losing something sacred. You might cry, you might grieve, you might wonder, for weeks or months or years, whether you made the right choice. Because the group taught you that love means obedience, that loyalty means silence, that leaving is sin, and that you should never, ever question what love really looks like. Obedience is love. In most relationships, Love grows alongside trust. You respect the other person's autonomy, even when they disagree with you. You accept their questions, their fears, their individual pace. But in high-control groups, love is redefined, not as freedom, but as loyalty, not as presence, but as obedience. You're told that to follow is to care, that to surrender is to evolve, that questioning isn't just doubt, it's distance. And that distance is interpreted not as a human need for space or clarity, but as a failure to love. This creates a strange kind of intimacy, one built on performance. You learn quickly that the way to belong is to align, that the way to be accepted is to comply, and that the only way to be seen as devoted is to obey without hesitation. If you hesitate, they'll wonder if your heart is truly open. If you ask too many questions, they'll worry that you're drifting. If you push back, even gently, it becomes evidence that you're not yet ready, or worse, that you're resisting transformation. So you begin to confuse compliance with connection. You say yes, even when you don't understand. You agree, even when something feels off. You repeat the lessons, even when they haven't landed, because your sense of love has become intertwined with your willingness to obey. This doesn't always come with threats. More often, it comes with praise. You're applauded for your devotion. You're celebrated for letting go of your resistance. You're told that your willingness to follow, especially when it's difficult, is what makes you special. And when others are corrected or shamed, you're quietly relieved it wasn't you this time. You tighten your own leash a little more, just to be safe. Gradually, you start measuring your worth by how little you question. And love, the kind that should feel mutual and warm and human, becomes a test of how much of yourself you're willing to give up. You internalize the idea that love isn't about being seen fully, but about shaping yourself to match the ideal. You speak less honestly. You think more cautiously. You begin to filter your emotions through a lens of acceptability. If you're angry, you call it ego. If you're tired, you tell yourself to go deeper. If you're lost, you remind yourself that doubt is part of the path, but too much doubt expressed too openly might mean you're falling behind. This is how obedience becomes emotional currency. You give it to show that you care. You expect it from others to prove that they care too. And slowly, you lose track of what love even felt like before it was wrapped in submission. By the time you notice the difference, it may already feel normal, natural, even. But somewhere underneath the surface, your instincts begin to push back. They raise quiet alarms. They whisper that true love should leave space for disagreement, that it doesn't demand silence in the name of unity. Still, you hesitate to listen, because in this world, any challenge to authority is framed as personal failure, and any attempt to reclaim your voice risks being labeled as selfish, immature, or spiritually lost. You might even start to wonder if your feelings are lying to you. And that's where the real manipulation begins. When doubt becomes a flaw and obedience becomes the measure of your heart, all it takes is one sentence to keep you in line. A soft voice, a calm tone, a gentle look, and the words, "If you really loved us, you wouldn't be questioning this." Spiritual gaslighting. In many faith traditions, spirituality is a path toward clarity, a search for meaning, connection, and personal truth. But in the hands of manipulative leaders, that path becomes a maze. The language stays the same: light, love, growth, surrender. But the way it's used distorts your ability to trust yourself. You begin to feel something is off. Maybe it's a rule that doesn't sit right, a contradiction that keeps resurfacing, or a gut instinct that refuses to settle. You try to speak up, cautiously. You express a doubt, or mention that something felt wrong. The response comes gently, even lovingly. That's your ego talking. You're projecting. You're not ready to hear the deeper truth yet. And just like that, the discomfort is no longer about what happened. It's about you. Your immaturity, your fear, your lack of faith. Spiritual gaslighting works because it sounds wise. It's cloaked in insight, using the same language as genuine self-reflection. but its purpose isn't to guide, it's to confuse, to take a valid concern and turn it into a spiritual flaw. The more you question, the more you're told that questioning itself is the problem. The more you trust your instincts, the more you're warned that instincts are unreliable, lower self, trauma, shadow. You end up in a loop where the only way to be seen as spiritually evolved is to silence your doubts. But in doing so, you lose your ability to tell whether what you're feeling is real or imagined. Gaslighting thrives in spaces where inner experience is already valued over external proof. There's no need for facts or explanations when everything can be dismissed as your projection. You could witness something cruel or manipulative, and if you bring it up, you're told you're just not seeing the lesson. You're still attached to duality. You haven't yet surrendered. The manipulation is subtle, which makes it hard to name. You're not being shouted down or punished directly. You're being nudged into mistrusting your own perception. And over time, you start to second-guess everything. If something doesn't feel right, you assume you're still learning. If you feel pain, you're told it's just resistance. If you experience a moment of clarity, it's reframed as ego masquerading as insight. So you try harder, you meditate longer, you journal more deeply, you search for the flaw in yourself that's making you uncomfortable with the very people who are shaping your worldview. And all the while, your sense of self is being rewritten, not by truth, but by control. You begin to feel grateful for being corrected, relieved when your doubts are reframed as lessons. You even start to preemptively question your own intuition before anyone else can. Because if the discomfort is always your fault, you can fix it. You don't need to leave. You just need to become more aligned. And in this way, the gaslighting isn't seen as abuse, it's seen as guidance. Eventually, you may find yourself fully disconnected from your own emotional compass. You no longer know whether something feels wrong because it is wrong or because you haven't yet done the work. And by the time you wonder if you've been manipulated, the tools to recognize it have already been stripped away. At that point, confusion is no longer a byproduct. It's the point. Confusion as control. In a healthy space, clarity is a sign of trust. Leaders speak plainly. Expectations are transparent. If you're confused, someone takes the time to help you understand, not to win you over, but to ensure you're making choices with full awareness. But in manipulative environments, clarity becomes a threat. Confusion isn't seen as a problem to fix. It's a strategy. You enter the group thinking you're stepping into a place of answers, a place of wisdom, of certainty, of higher truth. But the deeper you go, the more complicated things become. Teachings contradict themselves. Definitions shift mid-conversation. Rules apply differently depending on who's watching. And just when you think you've finally grasped the core belief, someone smiles and tells you that you're still not quite there. The confusion keeps you off balance. It forces you to rely on the group for interpretation. Instead of saying, "This doesn't make sense," you learn to say, "I must not be ready to understand." You assume the flaw is in you, not in the system. This works especially well in spiritual or psychological contexts, where complexity is expected. You're told that truth is layered, that only the enlightened will grasp it, that if something doesn't add up, it's because your consciousness hasn't caught up yet. So instead of asking for clarification, you study harder. You read between the lines. You wait for the next session, the next insight, the next cryptic lesson that might finally help it all click. But it never fully clicks. And that's by design. If they can keep you confused, they can keep you dependent. If every contradiction is framed as a teaching moment, then the more puzzled you are, the more devoted you must be. Confusion becomes a sign of humility, a badge of spiritual openness, and anyone who claims to feel confident in their understanding is dismissed as arrogant, asleep, or misled. It's not just the teachings that are unclear, it's the power structure. Roles are ambiguous. Boundaries shift without warning. Leaders speak in riddles, then chastise followers for misinterpreting. Sometimes you're praised for your vulnerability. Other times, the same vulnerability is used against you. What's expected today may be punished tomorrow. And if you push back, the reaction is calm but firm. That's just your conditioning. Keep going deeper. You begin to mistrust your ability to make sense of anything. You second-guess your own thinking. You wonder if your confusion is actually a form of spiritual resistance. You believe that staying confused is a necessary step toward insight, that someday when you're finally worthy, it will all become clear. Until then, you keep returning to the people who always seem one step ahead. You mimic their language. You adopt their tone. You nod at things you don't understand because it's safer than admitting you're lost. And the cycle continues. Because in a space built on confusion, clarity is rebellion. And the longer you stay confused, the easier it is for someone else to decide what's true for you. The urgency illusion. Most meaningful change takes time. Deep understanding unfolds gradually. Growth, real growth, is rarely rushed. But high-control groups know that urgency short-circuits critical thinking. The more pressured you feel, the less likely you are to pause and question. And so they manufacture urgency, not because something important is happening, but because it keeps you too busy to doubt. From the beginning, there's a sense that you've arrived just in time, that this moment is rare, sacred, fleeting, that something extraordinary is about to happen. And if you hesitate, even briefly, you'll miss it forever. You're told that this opportunity isn't always available, that the window is closing, that others are already ahead of you, moving faster, awakening deeper, letting go more completely. There's no time to process, no time to reflect. Just decide. Join now. Commit now. Change now. Any instinct to slow down is framed as resistance. Any desire to think it over is a sign that your old patterns are still in control. You're warned that waiting will cost you your growth, your chance at truth, your only shot at becoming who you were meant to be. This urgency isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet pressure woven into the culture. A look when you ask too many questions. A gentle nudge when you express hesitation. A reminder that time is precious, that you shouldn't waste another day living from the mind instead of the heart. It feels spiritual. It feels motivating. It feels like momentum. But what it really does is take away your space to choose freely. You start to feel like you're behind. Like everyone else already sees what you're struggling to grasp. And instead of giving yourself time, you rush to catch up. You agree to more than you understand. You say yes to things you haven't thought through. You confuse speed with sincerity. And the faster you move, the easier you are to lead. The illusion of urgency isn't just about decisions. It shapes your whole internal clock. Rest feels selfish. Doubt feels dangerous. Stillness feels like a threat. You tell yourself you'll slow down once you reach the next milestone. But there's always another level, another breakthrough, another chance to prove you're serious about the path. Even your emotions are put on a timer. If you're grieving, process it quickly. If you're afraid, let it go. If you're questioning, reframe it. Don't linger. Don't unravel. Don't disrupt the rhythm. Because the system doesn't run on reflection, it runs on momentum. Eventually, you start pushing yourself before anyone else has to. You silence your hesitation. You override your instincts. You rush into deeper commitment, not because it feels right, but because you're afraid of falling behind. Afraid of being seen as the one who hesitates while everyone else evolves. And somewhere in all that movement, you forget what it's like to move from clarity instead of pressure. You confuse the speed of your decision with the strength of your conviction. And by the time you pause long enough to breathe, you may realize that you've been sprinting toward a destination you never had the time to define for yourself. Privileged knowledge. There's a deep psychological reward in feeling chosen, in being handed something others don't have. In hearing that you've been entrusted with truth because you're finally ready, it makes you feel special, capable, set apart from the crowd. That's what privileged knowledge offers, not just information but identity. In manipulative systems, that feeling is weaponized. You're told that you've reached a level of understanding reserved for the few, that most people wouldn't be able to handle it, that you're different, more evolved, more open, more willing to face the uncomfortable truths that others deny. What's being offered isn't just insight, it's status. And once you've accepted that status, it's hard to let go of the belief that you're seeing what others can't. Often the knowledge itself isn't particularly new or shocking. Sometimes it's vague, sometimes convoluted, sometimes wrapped in metaphors that seem profound but don't hold up under scrutiny. But none of that matters. What matters is the framing that this knowledge is sacred, protected, hidden from the uninitiated because it could be misused or misunderstood. So if it feels confusing, the problem isn't with the content, it's with your readiness. You're told that questioning the teaching isn't curiosity, it's immaturity, that people who truly understand don't need to ask. They feel it in their bones. They surrender. They don't dissect it with logic. And if someone outside the group challenges the idea, they're dismissed as unenlightened, conditioned, blind. Their disbelief becomes proof of their distance from truth. And your ability to see beyond becomes proof that you're on the right path. The deeper you go, the more complex and abstract the teachings become. Each new layer makes you feel like you've unlocked something profound, even if it contradicts what came before. And every contradiction is explained as deeper mystery. Every inconsistency, a paradox you simply haven't integrated yet. You don't want to admit you're confused. You don't want to seem ungrateful. You've been told this is rare, this chance to hold such powerful wisdom. Walking away doesn't just mean stepping back from the group, it means turning your back on the truth itself. And so even when you have doubts, you keep going. You lean into the discomfort because that's what committed people do. You take pride in being misunderstood by outsiders. You internalize the idea that the world is asleep and you're among the few who've finally woken up. This mindset is isolating, but it's also reinforcing, because if the outside world just doesn't get it, then leaving the group feels like choosing ignorance, and staying feels like guarding something precious. Eventually, the knowledge stops being something you study and becomes something you defend. Even if you can't explain it, even if it doesn't make sense, and deep down, you suspect it might not be knowledge at all. The bond of sacrifice. Sacrifice can feel noble. It suggests devotion, purpose, a willingness to give something up for a greater good. In many cultures and philosophies, sacrifice is seen as a path to transformation, and within some groups, it's used to create powerful bonds, not just between individuals, but between followers and the system itself. In manipulative environments, sacrifice isn't a rare expression of commitment. It becomes expected, regular, gradual at first. A few hours of your time, a little extra money, a relationship you're told is holding you back, a dream that no longer aligns with the mission. You give a little, and you're praised for it. You feel seen, respected, spiritually mature. And then the requests grow. You're asked to move, to quit, to cut ties, to surrender privacy, to give until it hurts, and then a little more, because that's what true transformation looks like. If you hesitate, the message is clear. You're clinging to the self. You're still ruled by ego. The sacrifice isn't just for the group, it's for you. You begin to internalize the idea that pain is a sign of progress, that the more it costs, the more it must be worth. That comfort is weakness, and resistance is spiritual immaturity. This framing works because the process doesn't feel like coercion. It feels like a test of your devotion. You believe that by letting go of attachments, you're becoming lighter, freer, more aligned with the truth you've been given. And every time you give something up, the group steps in with reassurance. You're growing, you're ascending, you're finally becoming who you were meant to be. But underneath that encouragement lies something deeper: control. Because once you've given something up, it's much harder to walk away. You've made sacrifices. You've changed your life. You've lost people you loved. You've let go of parts of yourself. And the more you've given, the more invested you are in believing it was worth it. To leave now would mean admitting you lost something for nothing. So you stay, you sacrifice again, and each act of giving becomes a quiet tether. You tell yourself that those on the outside wouldn't understand, that their lives are still run by fear, by attachment, by selfishness. But the truth is harder to face, that some of your sacrifices weren't freely chosen. They were shaped by pressure, by isolation, by the slow erasure of options. Still, you carry them with pride. Because if you can't reclaim what you gave up, the only thing left is to believe it made you better. And the deeper that belief runs, the tighter the bond becomes. Not just to the group, but to the version of yourself that keeps giving, because stopping might mean admitting that the cost wasn't sacred after all. It was just the price of control. Public shame, private pain. Most people don't change through humiliation. They may comply, go quiet, fall in line, but inside they shrink. Shame closes us off. It disconnects us from others, from ourselves. And in manipulative groups, that's often the point. Public shame becomes a tool, not for growth, but for control. It usually begins with small corrections. A gentle rebuke, a pointed question in front of others. You're told it's just feedback, a chance to grow. But there's a tension in the room. Everyone watches how you respond, whether you cry, defend yourself, or thank the speaker for their wisdom. And if you react the wrong way, the pressure only increases. Soon, correction turns into spectacle. You're asked to admit faults out loud, to confess not just your actions but your thoughts. You're told to dig deeper, to uncover what's really going on beneath your resistance. And as you speak, the group nods, watches, judges. You're encouraged to own everything, to apologize even when you're not sure what for. It's framed as accountability, as transparency, but it doesn't feel like healing. It feels like exposure. And afterward, you're expected to be grateful. You're told this is how real change happens, that only those who are truly committed can sit in the fire, that the pain you feel is the burning away of your old self. And if it still hurts later, you're reminded that pain is ego, and ego is the enemy. But while the group moves on, you don't forget. You carry the sting of it, the embarrassment, the confusion, the sense that your vulnerability wasn't protected but put on display, and yet you don't speak up. You worry that doing so would mark you as fragile, unready, resistant, so you smile. You nod. You thank the group for the lesson. And then you stay quiet. You start policing your own mind more carefully, watching your tone, your language, your doubts. You try to preempt any future shame by being extra devoted. You volunteer more. You praise more. You confess before being asked. It becomes a performance of purity because the cost of slipping is too high. What gets lost in all this is your ability to trust yourself, to feel safe in your own emotional experience. You no longer know whether your guilt is genuine or conditioned, whether your pain is healing or just something to hide. And for those who witness these moments but aren't in the spotlight themselves, the message is equally clear. Don't step out of line. Don't question. Don't falter, because if it happens to someone else today, it could be you tomorrow. Public shame becomes a warning, a ritualized reminder that the group decides who is good, who is failing, and who gets to belong. And private pain becomes the cost of staying. A quiet ache you learn to carry, because in a system like this, your suffering isn't a signal that something's wrong. It's proof you're still on the path. Saving the world excuse. There's a certain glow that surrounds a cause deemed bigger than any individual. It gives purpose, urgency, and a sense of moral clarity. And in many groups, this is the hook. You're not just here for yourself, you're here to save the world. That framing changes everything. It reframes sacrifice as duty, submission as service, obedience as virtue. You're told the group holds the key to humanity's future, that the work you're doing isn't just important, it's vital, essential. If you walk away, it's not just your life that suffers. It's everyone's. The planet, the children, the collective soul of humankind. At first, this message can feel empowering. You feel like you've been given a rare opportunity, that your life finally matters in a deeper way. But over time, it becomes a leash. You're no longer allowed to be tired, uncertain, or disillusioned because there's too much at stake. You don't have the luxury of questioning the methods. You can't afford to wait until everything makes sense. You have to trust the process. The mission matters more than your comfort, your doubts, your individuality. And if something doesn't feel right, you're reminded that resistance is normal when you're doing work that changes the world. This justification becomes a shield for everything that follows. Why are you being asked to stay silent? Because unity is necessary for the mission. Why are you discouraged from seeing family or old friends? Because their energy might pull you away from your purpose. Why are you working for free, under pressure, with no boundaries? Because the work is bigger than you. Everything becomes excusable, even manipulation, even cruelty, even exhaustion. When the mission is framed as sacred, any dissent can be treated as betrayal, and leaders don't need to explain themselves. They're the ones guiding the transformation. They hold the vision. Your job is to follow, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because the more it hurts, the more it proves your devotion. This logic is powerful because it distorts something genuinely human, the desire to help, to matter, to leave the world better than you found it. But instead of nurturing that drive, the group uses it as leverage. Your goodness becomes a tool of your own subjugation. You don't fight back because good people don't make it about themselves. Eventually, your own well-being becomes irrelevant. You wear your exhaustion like a badge of honor. You swallow your concerns because you've learned to call them distractions, and when others leave, you assume they just weren't strong enough to stay committed. But underneath the noble rhetoric, you begin to feel something strange, a quiet disconnection from your own instincts. You're not sure what's right anymore, only what's required. Because when saving the world becomes a blanket explanation, there's no room left to ask whether the world you're helping to build still feels like one worth living in. Control through intimacy. Most people don't notice when control begins with affection. That's what makes it effective. It doesn't arrive with rules or demands. It arrives with warmth, a hand on the shoulder, a knowing smile, the feeling of being seen in a way you didn't know you needed. In high-control environments, intimacy isn't just emotional, it's strategic. From the moment you join, you're welcomed with a kind of intensity that feels rare. People want to know everything about you. They listen closely, ask questions, nod with deep understanding. You're encouraged to share, to open up, to be vulnerable. It feels like trust, but it's something else. Because this kind of intimacy isn't grounded in reciprocity, it's guided, directed, designed to deepen your bond to the group, not to foster mutual understanding. The more you reveal, the more tightly you're woven into the system. Your past pain, your doubts, your insecurities, all become part of the story they reflect back to you. And then it turns. What once felt like comfort begins to feel like exposure. The things you shared freely now shape how you're seen. A moment of hesitation becomes a pattern. A question becomes a flaw. You're reminded gently or otherwise that you once admitted your own weakness, that they know what you struggle with, even when you pretend you don't. Support becomes supervision. Caring eyes become watchful ones. The same people who praised your vulnerability now use it to explain your resistance. You're just afraid, they say. This is your pattern. We've seen this before. And so you fold again. You share more, hoping to realign yourself with their approval. You second-guess your instincts because they know you so well. You stop drawing boundaries because the intimacy has erased the line between personal and collective, between yours and theirs. Control through intimacy doesn't rely on coercion. It doesn't have to. Because the more deeply someone feels known, the more afraid they become of losing that connection. You start to believe that without them, no one will understand you like this again. that your story only makes sense here. Eventually, you stop questioning the closeness, even when it feels invasive. You begin to conflate exposure with love, surveillance with support, and you keep opening yourself up, even when it leaves you feeling smaller, more dependent, less whole. Because in a system that builds loyalty through emotional fusion, your secrets aren't used to protect you. They're used to shape you. And when that kind of closeness is all you've known for a while, anything beyond it starts to feel not just unfamiliar, but dangerous. Demonizing the outside. One of the most effective ways to keep someone in is to convince them that everything outside is poisoned, that beyond the group's walls lies only ignorance, corruption, and threat. And slowly, almost without noticing, the outside world begins to feel not just different, but dangerous. At first, it's subtle. You hear things like, "They wouldn't understand," or "Most people are too asleep to see what you see now." There's a quiet flattery in it. You've been chosen. You're awake. You've found something rare. It sets you apart, elevates you, gives you a new identity rooted in awareness others supposedly lack. But over time, the language sharpens. Friends become distractions. Family becomes an obstacle. Society becomes the enemy. You're warned about influences that could pull you off the path. Conversations with outsiders are framed as contamination. Every doubt they raise, every contradiction they point out, is twisted into proof that they're part of the problem. And if you start to miss them, your friends, your past, your life before, it's not treated as normal grief. It's framed as weakness, as backsliding, as a test of your loyalty to something higher. So, you begin to retreat. You stop explaining your choices. You avoid people who ask too many questions. You learn to speak in code, or not at all. Your world shrinks, not because someone locks you in, but because you've been taught to fear what lies beyond. Even your memories of before are reshaped. You're encouraged to reframe your past through the lens of your new beliefs. Childhood joys are reinterpreted as signs of early trauma. Former mentors are now misguided. Old values were illusions. The group helps you rewrite the narrative of who you've always been, aligning it more closely with who they say you are now. This narrative creates a powerful double bind. The outside world is said to be sick, and if you start missing it, it must mean the sickness is still in you. So you push those feelings down. You look around and see others nodding, repeating the same mantras, insisting they've never felt freer. And part of you starts to believe it too. You remind yourself that comfort is not the goal. Truth is, and truth, you've been told, lives only here. Eventually, the idea of leaving doesn't just seem risky, it feels impossible. Not because there's a physical barrier, but because the world beyond has been painted as hollow, shallow, or even evil. You're not just staying to protect yourself, you're staying to protect the light you've found, the special knowledge, the mission. Demonizing the outside creates an ecosystem of isolation. It ensures that any voice challenging the group's authority sounds suspicious, that any alternative seems misguided, that curiosity itself becomes a form of betrayal. And when that belief takes hold deeply enough, you don't need to be told to stay. You tell it to yourself. Rewriting your memories. Memory feels like solid ground. We rely on it to shape who we are, where we've been, what we've survived. But in high-control environments, that ground is slowly softened, redrawn with new meaning, new weight, and a new lens that distorts more than it clarifies. The process rarely begins with outright denial. It starts with suggestion, gentle reinterpretation. A leader or group member might say, "Are you sure it happened that way?" Or "It's normal to misremember things when you've been under so much influence." Doubt is planted not to encourage truth, but to erode trust in your own recollection. You're taught that the past was darker than you thought, that your family relationships weren't as loving, your old teachers not as wise, your accomplishments not as pure. The group offers an alternative story, one where you were lost, confused, misled, until you found this truth, this community, this path. Soon, the memories that don't serve the group's narrative are quietly replaced. Joy is reframed as ignorance. Pride becomes delusion. Pain that doesn't connect to the group's ideology is downplayed, while pain that reinforces it is emphasized, even embellished. You're praised for seeing it clearly now. You start retelling your own life with new filters, convinced that this version must be more accurate because it aligns with your new beliefs. This doesn't just change how you remember, it changes how you feel about what you remember. A loving parent becomes controlling. A moment of personal freedom becomes selfishness. Your previous doubts about the group fade because you start to believe they were never real, or if they were, they came from the broken, unawakened version of yourself. Over time, the group becomes the only trustworthy source of interpretation. If your memories don't match the teachings win. You're told the truth isn't always what it feels like, that your perceptions have been shaped by trauma, media, society, or ego, that without the group's guidance, you're susceptible to false narratives, even your own. This subtle manipulation makes it nearly impossible to leave, because leaving would mean trusting yourself again, trusting the very instincts and memories you've been taught to doubt. And by now, they feel distant, like echoes of someone you used to be, but no longer are. It's not just your future that's been rewritten, it's your past. And once your history has been reauthored by someone else, you begin to wonder what parts of you are still real, which version of your story belongs to you, and whether there's any part of yourself left that hasn't been reshaped to fit someone else's design. That question lingers, especially when a thought slips through that doesn't fit the script, one you hesitate to even admit to yourself, because what happens when the thoughts you can't speak start becoming the ones you can't ignore? Thoughts you can't admit. In a tightly controlled system, not all rebellion begins on the outside. Often, it starts in a quiet corner of the mind, with a flicker of discomfort, a flash of confusion, a whisper of doubt that arrives without permission. At first, it's easy to ignore. After all, you're surrounded by certainty. Everyone seems aligned. Smiles are constant. Praise flows freely. The ideology is airtight. And so when a troubling thought surfaces about the leader, the teachings, or even your place in the system, it feels like an anomaly, something to dismiss, a momentary lapse in understanding. But the thought doesn't go away. It returns, not louder, but heavier. You start to wonder, is this doubt? Is it disloyalty? Or worse, could it be proof that you're still flawed, still not fully transformed like they say you should be? The problem isn't just the thought itself, it's what the thought represents. In a system that equates obedience with virtue and questions with weakness, thinking the wrong thing feels dangerous, not just socially, but morally. You're told that the path is pure, that those who falter do so because of inner corruption, spiritual immaturity, or unresolved trauma. So you keep it to yourself. You learn to smile, nod, repeat the words you're expected to say, and beneath that surface, you wage a silent war. A war not against the group, but against your own mind. This is how thought reform takes root, not by erasing every independent idea, but by making you ashamed of having them. The system doesn't need to punish you for thinking the wrong thing. It's more effective if you punish yourself. You begin to monitor your internal world. You reframe your questions as personal failings. You rehearse the right answers in case anyone asks. You convince yourself that the moment will pass, that clarity will return, that the doubt is a test, or worse, a temptation. Over time, you don't just hide your thoughts from others, you begin to hide them from yourself. You push them into corners, avoid quiet moments, stay busy with tasks or rituals designed to keep you aligned, because in stillness, the forbidden thoughts return. And with them, the unbearable tension between what you believe and what you're expected to believe. This tension isn't resolved, it's buried. And that's the cost of a system that demands mental conformity. Your inner life becomes a place you no longer trust. You live in your head like it's someone else's house. Every thought passes through a filter, Every question must be translated before it's spoken, if it's spoken at all. Eventually, it's not just that you can't admit your thoughts, it's that you no longer know which ones are truly yours. And yet, even in the midst of this internal silence, the performance must go on. You must look the part, smile the part, believe the part, until belief itself becomes a costume you never take off. Wearing the smile always, there's a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. A practiced, polished expression worn like a uniform in high-control environments. That smile isn't just encouraged, it's expected. Not as a reflection of how you feel, but as proof of who you are, or more precisely, who you've become under their influence. At first, it feels harmless. Just a bit of social performance. You smile to reassure others, to show gratitude, to fit in. But over time, that smile becomes something else entirely. It becomes a symbol of your allegiance, a mask that hides complexity, and a barrier between your inner experience and the outer world. In many groups, visible happiness is equated with truth. The idea is simple. If the system works, you should be joyful. If you're not joyful, then something must be wrong, not with the system, but with you. So the smile becomes a kind of obligation, a signal that you're aligned, that you're grateful, that you're on the right path. And if you're not smiling, that too is noticed. A neutral face becomes a warning sign. A sigh is suspicious. A moment of quiet may be interpreted as doubt. You find yourself being asked, "Is everything okay?" in a tone that implies it shouldn't not be. Over time, you learn to regulate your face before you even understand your feelings, to preempt concern, to avoid scrutiny. So you keep smiling. Even when you're exhausted, even when you're conflicted, even when you're uncertain about what you're being told or asked to do, you smile, not just to convince others, but to convince yourself. Because if you look like you're thriving, maybe you are. But something happens when you're never allowed to drop the act. You begin to disconnect from your own emotions. Happiness, fear, relief, sadness, all get funneled through one expression. You become a performer who never leaves the stage, whose identity is wrapped around a role so tightly that the role starts to replace the person. And the smile, once effortless, once real, starts to ache. There's a quiet kind of burnout that comes from pretending everything is fine for too long, from carrying joy like it's a duty rather than a feeling. And eventually, even the joy itself starts to feel artificial, manufactured, like a performance for an audience that never looks away. In this system, breaking character feels like a moral failure. Admitting exhaustion is dangerous. Expressing anger, even silently, is seen as disloyal. And so you keep showing up, smile in place, voice bright, eyes trained on something just out of reach. Because to stop smiling would be to admit that something inside you isn't whole anymore. And the system can't allow that. But cracks always form. Not all at once, slowly, in the muscles of your face, in the corners of your eyes, in the stillness between performances. Until one day, behind the fixed expression, something begins to slip. Not rebellion, not rage, just weariness. And that's often where the next phase begins. When the effort to perform becomes so great, so constant, so heavy, that obedience starts to feel like the only relief. Exhaustion into obedience. The process begins subtly. You're asked to show commitment, to stay longer, to do more, to prove your devotion through action. Meetings stretch late into the night. Tasks multiply. Expectations rise. You start to sacrifice sleep, free time, and solitude, not out of fear, but because everyone else is doing the same. Control doesn't always arrive through fear or force. Sometimes it walks in quietly, on the heels of fatigue. In high-demand groups, obedience often comes not through persuasion, but through exhaustion, a slow wearing down of the mind, the will, the body. But your body keeps the score. There's pride in it at first. A sense of purpose. You're not just part of something. You're giving yourself to it. That sacrifice becomes a badge of honor. You're praised for your dedication. The group affirms that this level of service is special, even sacred. Fatigue dulls your thinking. The long hours chip away at your ability to reflect or question. Your attention narrows. You focus on getting through the day, not evaluating what the day actually means. Complex emotions are replaced by simple goals. Stay aligned, stay accepted, stay awake. In this state, suggestion becomes more powerful. You don't have the energy to argue or even to consider alternatives. Doubt requires mental effort, and effort is in short supply. Compliance feels easier than confrontation. So when someone tells you what to believe, what to feel, what to do, you do it. Not because you're convinced, but because resistance now feels too expensive. There's a kind of peace in surrendering your will when you're too tired to hold on to it. You stop questioning, not because you're convinced, but because you can't afford to care. You nod along because thinking has become a luxury. Reflection feels like a weight you're not strong enough to lift. And it doesn't feel like breaking. It feels like adapting. This is where obedience thrives. Not in clarity, but in exhaustion. Not in confidence, but in depletion. You start to internalize the voice of the group. You anticipate instructions before they're given. You edit your thoughts before they form. You fall into rhythm. Tasks blur together. The line between serving and surviving disappears. Eventually, it doesn't occur to you that there could be another way. This isn't what you would have chosen at the beginning. But by now, choosing feels like a foreign concept. And then, something shifts. The fatigue doesn't go away, but it's no longer a barrier. It's the condition you've adjusted to. The constant demand becomes your baseline. Your decisions, your beliefs, your identity begin to orbit the structure that drains you simply because there's no space left to build anything else. And when a system succeeds in making exhaustion feel normal, the only thing left to control is what you do with what little energy remains. That energy is carefully watched, tracked, measured. Because once obedience becomes instinct, the next step is making sure it never slips. Living under watch. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over people who know they're being watched. It isn't just the absence of sound, it's the suppression of spontaneity, an inner tightening, a filtering of thoughts before they become words, of expressions before they reach the face. In systems built on control, surveillance isn't just about cameras or microphones, it's about making people internalize the gaze. At first, the awareness is external. You notice how others speak, how they perform belief, how they repeat the group's phrases with just the right tone. You hear yourself mimicking them, carefully, consciously. You adjust your posture. You catch yourself before expressing uncertainty. You learn what earns approval and what invites suspicion. And slowly, that learning becomes habit. Then something more subtle happens. You stop noticing the performance because it never drops. Even when you're alone, the voice in your head isn't entirely yours. It evaluates, it corrects, it reframes. You second-guess jokes, memories, desires. You rehearse conversations in advance, not to prepare but to censor. What if someone misinterprets? What if someone reports it? Because in these environments, watching isn't always technological. It's communal. People are encouraged to observe one another, to uplift each other through correction, to protect the group by identifying those who might drift. The line between care and control is blurred, and the watchfulness is dressed in noble language, accountability, vigilance, spiritual responsibility. So even kindness becomes a tool of compliance. And even when no one's around, you don't feel alone. You feel observed. Not by any one person, but by a collective expectation. A presence that demands purity, loyalty, perfection. You edit your internal life the way others edit their public one. You become your own watcher. This is where the real effectiveness of control lies, not in punishment, but in anticipation of it. You're not obeying because you're forced to. You're obeying because the very idea of disobedience feels alien, foreign, dangerous. You learn to interpret the smallest feedback as a sign, a pause in conversation, a shift in tone, a question asked twice. You read too deeply into a glance. You overanalyze your own behavior. You apologize before anyone takes offense. You punish yourself for thoughts no one else could hear. And that's the goal, not just obedience, but self-policing. When the line between belief and behavior becomes invisible, and the eyes that watch you no longer need to be real. Because once you're convinced that someone is always watching, you start to believe that someone always should be. And once that belief is in place, the system only needs one more thing to keep it stable. A threat, something to fear, something to unify against, something that makes even surveillance feel like protection. Inventing the perfect enemy, control often needs more than belief to survive. It needs fear, but fear alone isn't enough. It must be pointed somewhere. In high-control groups, the creation of a perfect enemy serves that purpose. An ever-present, ever-threatening figure or force that justifies the group's rules, rituals, and restrictions. This enemy doesn't have to be a real person. It can be an ideology, a system, an unseen threat. What matters is that it's out there, and it wants to undo everything the group claims to stand for. It threatens purity, it spreads confusion, it hides behind friendly faces. And most importantly, it cannot be reasoned with. In this way, the enemy becomes a mirror of the group's own extremes. If the group is peaceful, the enemy is violent. If the group is enlightened, the enemy is corrupt. And if the group claims love, the enemy must embody hate. There's no room for ambiguity. The world outside is painted in stark contrast, and every story, every teaching, every shared fear reinforces that image. This does something powerful to the mind. It creates a sense of siege, a feeling that safety is conditional, that survival depends on vigilance, unity, and loyalty. The group begins to frame itself not just as right, but as righteous, not just strong, but endangered. And suddenly, even the most invasive rules feel protective. Sacrifices become necessities. Limits become shields. When members begin to doubt, the enemy is always there to explain the discomfort. If someone feels uneasy, it's because the enemy is attacking their spirit. If someone leaves, it's because they were seduced by the enemy's lies. No criticism can be legitimate because the critic is already lost. The enemy explains everything, even pain. And when an outsider questions the group, that outsider confirms the narrative. See, they say. That's exactly what the enemy would say. In this way, the enemy is self-sustaining, immune to evidence, immune to nuance. But the most effective part of the perfect enemy isn't what it threatens, it's what it replaces. It shifts attention outward. It prevents people from turning their gaze inward, from asking questions the group can't answer. The more energy spent fearing the outside, the less left to examine the inside. And this fear bonds people together. It builds loyalty through shared dread. The enemy becomes part of the group's identity, something to fight against, to prove yourself against. And in that fight, every doubt, every impulse to leave, every uncomfortable truth can be buried under the weight of imagined war. But not all fear is about attack. Some fear goes deeper, not the fear of being destroyed from the outside, but of being lost on the inside, of what might happen if you stepped outside the walls, if you saw the world without the filter, if you let go of the enemy and had to face what freedom really meant. Fear of real freedom. Leaving isn't always a matter of walking away. For many, it's not the locked doors or the social pressure that keeps them inside. It's the fear of what exists outside. In high-control systems, freedom is not framed as liberation. It's framed as danger. Real freedom is chaotic. It requires you to decide, to question, to live without a script. And if you've spent enough time being told who you are, what to believe, and how to behave, that kind of responsibility can feel overwhelming, terrifying even. Inside the group, every decision has meaning. Every action is part of a larger purpose. You don't need to define your values from scratch. You don't have to wrestle with moral complexity. You're guided, affirmed, protected. Doubts may arise, but you're taught how to answer them. Often those answers are simple, absolute, and comforting. But freedom doesn't offer those guarantees. It asks you to make sense of your own thoughts, to live with contradictions, to confront the unknown without someone else translating it for you. It's not a lack of boundaries that people fear. It's the responsibility of drawing their own. The group knows this. It reinforces the idea that freedom is a trick, that life outside is cold, meaningless, and corrupt, that those who leave aren't free, they're lost. You're told they end up broken, bitter, wandering, that without the group, people crumble under the weight of too many choices and too little truth. So instead of imagining freedom as possibility, you imagine it as abandonment, isolation, a world without structure. And if you've never lived outside that structure, that narrative can become your reality. There's also something else. When your life has been built around proving your loyalty, the idea of leaving isn't just frightening, it's humiliating. Everything you sacrificed, everything you believed in would need to be reevaluated. What if the people you once dismissed were right? What if the enemy you feared never existed? What if you gave your devotion to something that didn't deserve it? So staying feels safer, easier, not because you're happy or fulfilled, but because you know the rules, you know what's expected. And after enough time, that predictability starts to look like peace. These questions don't just cause discomfort, they threaten your entire identity. But peace that depends on not thinking too hard is fragile. It breaks the moment you let yourself wonder whether the walls around you are sheltering you or hiding something from you. And in that quiet space between comfort and courage, another voice always waits. Not the one that doubts, but the one that silences doubt. The voice that tells you it's better not to ask, that questions are dangerous, that trust means never needing to know everything. That voice, too, is part of the system, and it speaks louder every time you come close to the edge. Authority without questions. In the early days of joining a group, there's often a sense of relief. Someone else knows the way. Someone has the answers. And when the world feels uncertain, that clarity is a comfort. You don't need to figure everything out. You just need to trust the one who already has. But over time, that trust shifts from voluntary to mandatory. What begins as admiration becomes doctrine. The leader isn't just someone who knows more. They become someone who must not be questioned. Their words carry a different weight. Their choices don't need explaining. Their authority becomes self-justifying. This is the foundation of control. Authority that asks for trust but punishes inquiry. You can express confusion, but not skepticism. You can ask for clarification, but only within the lines of loyalty. And if you ever push too hard, if your questions come from a place of real curiosity, you're met with silence, shame, or worse. Because in high-control environments, questions are rarely seen as a path to truth. They're seen as threats to stability. Leaders in these systems often cloak their certainty in virtue. They claim insight, revelation, or moral superiority. They speak in absolutes. They present complex issues as simple and simple issues as profound. And when followers echo their words, not as opinions but as facts, those echoes reinforce the leader's status. The feedback loop tightens. Doubt is framed as weakness. Independent thinking is rebranded as ego. Trust is measured by how quickly you accept, not how deeply you understand. The result is a hierarchy not just of power but of thought. Eventually, the community learns not to challenge, not because they've all been convinced, but because they've been trained to feel discomfort at the idea of challenging. The leader becomes untouchable, not through force, but through culture, through repetition. Through unspoken rules that everyone understands, even if no one ever says them out loud. This has consequences. People stop exploring their own questions. They hesitate before voicing concerns. They learn to mimic certainty instead of seeking clarity. And the group begins to lose its capacity for growth, because growth requires tension, contradiction, and the willingness to admit when something doesn't make sense. But in a space where authority is never examined, nothing is allowed not to make sense. So what emerges is not wisdom, but performance. Not faith, but choreography. Everyone plays their part, repeating the lines handed down to them, nodding at the right moments, suppressing the flicker of doubt when something doesn't feel right. And over time, that flicker fades, not because it was answered, but because it was ignored for so long, it stopped asking. But there's another form of control that seeps even deeper. One that doesn't just restrict what you can question, but shapes how you speak, and eventually, how you think. The trap of shared language. At first, it seems like nothing more than a set of terms. A few unusual words, phrases that don't show up in everyday conversations. But slowly, the language of the group begins to change the way people think. What starts as shorthand becomes a filter, a way of dividing the world into those who understand and those who don't. Inside the group, this shared language feels powerful. It creates a sense of belonging. You know the right words to use, the proper phrases to say when something goes wrong, and the comforting slogans that quiet your doubts. There's a kind of safety in that, a ritual in the repetition. It tells you who you are, but it also tells you what not to say. The boundaries of expression become boundaries of thought. Certain words are discouraged because they carry the wrong implications. Others are used so frequently they stop meaning anything at all. A simple question like, why, becomes rephrased into something more acceptable, something that sounds curious without sounding rebellious. The group builds its own vocabulary, but it also strips old words of their weight. Love becomes obedience. Freedom becomes submission. Doubt becomes sin. What seems like semantic drift is actually a quiet rearrangement of the mind. When the meaning of words changes, the range of thought narrows. Eventually, it becomes difficult to even form certain ideas. You might feel discomfort, but you won't have the language to describe it. You might sense something wrong, but the only words available to you lead back to the group's logic. In this way, language doesn't just express thought, it shapes it. And the trap tightens in a specific way. It doesn't feel like a trap. You're not silenced in the traditional sense. You can speak. You can share. You can repeat the teachings, express your faith, encourage others. But those words flow along paths that have already been laid. They don't leave room to wander. If you try to step outside those paths, if you use a word the group hasn't sanctioned or say something that doesn't fit the script, you're corrected, maybe gently, maybe publicly, and you learn. You learn which words are safe, which questions are clever enough to be allowed, and which ones cross an invisible line. Over time, this self-monitoring becomes automatic. You edit your thoughts before they turn into speech. You recite phrases that no longer stir anything in you because they're expected. And slowly, you forget what your own voice used to sound like. Language in its purest form is a tool of connection. But in these environments, it becomes a gatekeeper. If you speak the right way, you're one of us. If you don't, you're suspect. The words become more than communication. They become identity. And once identity is shaped by that kind of language, it can feel dangerous to imagine speaking any other way. Especially when the words don't just describe what is right, but who is good, and that next step begins to turn the group's values into something even more powerful and more dangerous. Morality is often thought of as something personal, something shaped by conscience, reflection, and lived experience. But inside high-control groups, that sense of personal morality is replaced with something external. The group decides what is right. The leader decides what is wrong, and everyone else learns to follow. Morality defined by the group. It doesn't happen all at once. At first, the moral rules of the group might seem familiar. Be honest. Be loyal. Be generous. These are easy to accept. They feel aligned with basic human values, but over time, those rules start to shift. Not outwardly, but in interpretation. Be honest becomes tell only the group's version of the truth. Be loyal becomes never question what you're told. And be generous becomes sacrifice without limits. You're told that following these rules makes you good, that obedience is virtue, that agreement is maturity. And when you stray, even slightly, you don't just break a rule, you risk being cast as someone immoral, someone selfish, someone dangerous. This reshaping of morality is not always harsh. Sometimes it's subtle. People in the group may frame it as growth. They might say you're being purified, refined, elevated, that you're learning to shed the selfishness of your old life. But the effect is the same. Your sense of right and wrong becomes dependent on what others tell you it is. And once that happens, it becomes difficult to know where your own values end and the group's begin. If you feel uneasy about something the group promotes, that discomfort is labeled as a flaw in you. If you hesitate before following an order, you're told it's because you're not spiritually ready. If you notice cruelty or contradiction, it's because your heart is not pure enough to see the deeper truth. The group always remains righteous. The doubt always belongs to you. This moral inversion is especially powerful because it recruits your own desire to be good. Most people don't want to cause harm. Most people want to live with integrity. So when a group tells you that questioning is betrayal and submission is love, it doesn't feel like control, it feels like guidance. And the more you accept, the more the standard rises. What was once a noble effort becomes an obligation. What was once encouraged becomes expected. And eventually you're judged not by how you treat others, but by how perfectly you align with the group's ideals. There's no space for moral complexity, no tolerance for gray areas. Every choice is painted in black and white. Every doubt is a failure. Every deviation is a weakness. But beneath this system of control, a deeper transformation is taking place. It's no longer just about doing the right thing. It's about fearing the wrong impulse. Even the thoughts that come uninvited, especially the ones that hint at something unapproved. And that fear of your own inner life becomes the next layer of control. And the most effective part of this structure is that it doesn't require constant enforcement. Once internalized, people begin to monitor themselves. They feel guilt before anyone accuses them. They confess before anyone asks. They punish themselves long before the group needs to. Making you fear yourself. Most people are taught that their inner world is a private place, a space where thoughts come and go, shaped by experience, emotion, and memory. In a healthy setting, that space can be a refuge, a place to reflect, to question, to grow. But in certain groups, that private landscape becomes a battleground. Not because of what's outside, but because of what you're told might already be inside. It starts with suspicion not of others, but of yourself. You're told that certain thoughts are signs of weakness, that doubt is dangerous, that anger, fear, or even curiosity could mean something is wrong with you spiritually or morally. Suddenly, thoughts aren't just thoughts, they're proof. Evidence that you're not as loyal, faithful, or pure as you should be. The group teaches that bad thoughts must be fought, that your mind can betray you, that your feelings cannot be trusted. And once that belief is in place, every mental flicker becomes a potential threat. You become alert to yourself in a way that's exhausting, hyper-aware of what you think, how you feel, and whether those inner movements align with what the group says is right. There's no escape in silence either. Even keeping certain thoughts to yourself can be seen as concealment. You might be encouraged or pressured to confess, to admit that you felt disconnected, questioned a teaching, or failed to feel the expected emotions. And often, the act of confession doesn't bring relief. It brings surveillance. You're watched more closely, guided more firmly, reminded of how easily the mind can slip. The result is a constant state of inner tension. You can't relax into yourself. You can't trust your own perceptions. If something doesn't sit right, the instinct is to blame yourself, not the message. And slowly, you begin to doubt your ability to know anything on your own. This fear isn't always loud. It doesn't always show up as panic or dread. Sometimes it's just a quiet resistance to your own intuition. A hesitation to feel too deeply, to think too freely, to want something not already approved. You learn to flinch before your own mind does something unpredictable. The damage accumulates slowly. You second-guess every reaction. You rehearse conversations before speaking. You scan yourself for signs of impurity. And all the while, the group's voice becomes louder than your own. Not because it's shouting, but because it's always there. In this environment, self-doubt becomes safety. The more you distrust your own instincts, the more you turn to the group, the more you fear your own thoughts, the more you seek their guidance, and what began as spiritual humility turns into quiet self-erasure. Eventually, the fear of who you might be without them becomes stronger than the discomfort of staying. And that fear, that deep, quiet fear, is exactly where the next technique begins. Because sometimes the doubt that paralyzes you isn't accidental. It's planted there on purpose. Doubt is planted on purpose. Doubt can be a powerful tool for discovery. In science, it opens questions. In philosophy, it drives inquiry. In relationships, it can lead to clarity and honesty. But in high-control groups, doubt is used differently. It's not meant to expand your understanding. It's meant to collapse it directly into the arms of those in power. The strategy isn't to eliminate all uncertainty. In fact, the opposite often works better. Leaders or group doctrines may allow small doubts to exist, not about the group, but about you. You're taught to trust the system fully, but question yourself endlessly. The teachings are perfect. The path is sacred. If you're struggling, the fault must lie within. This kind of doubt doesn't feel like the natural uncertainty of being human. It's a chronic, carefully cultivated sense that something inside you is not quite right. Maybe you're not committed enough. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you just aren't trying hard enough. The group assures you that the answers are clear and available, so when they don't make sense to you, the conclusion is obvious. You're the problem. That doubt doesn't exist on its own. It's usually paired with a promise. If you work harder, pray deeper, study longer, or submit more fully, the confusion will go away. You'll reach a higher level of clarity. You'll finally get it. This keeps you cycling between failure and aspiration, unsure of where you stand, but always certain of where you need to go. And when that moment of clarity doesn't come, when the teachings still feel contradictory or the leader still feels fallible, you're told it's a test. You're being refined. You're being made stronger through struggle. It becomes dangerous to admit that the struggle feels endless. To say so would sound ungrateful, immature, or even corrupted. So you stay silent, and the doubt deepens. Over time, this internal instability becomes a kind of loyalty test. Those who question openly are seen as unstable. Those who suffer quietly are praised for their humility. It sends a clear message. The more you doubt yourself and trust the group, the more faithful you are. Eventually, you begin to suppress any thoughts that don't match the group's narrative. You preemptively censor your mind, afraid that any spark of skepticism might grow into something dangerous. You don't want to be like the people they warned you about, the ones who fell away, who turned bitter, who became enemies of the truth. But here's the trick. The group never resolves your doubt, because if they did, you wouldn't need them as much. They want you uncertain, but not rebellious, dependent, but not broken, always striving, but never arriving. And this state of suspended clarity becomes the new normal. You learn to live with a quiet unease, not because it makes sense, but because it's safer than the alternative. What's most striking is that doubt, once a sign of thinking, becomes a signal to stop thinking. It becomes a warning light, redirecting you not outward, but inward, where the only path to relief is deeper submission. But relief isn't the only lure. Sometimes what keeps people in place isn't fear or guilt. It's hope. A particular kind of hope, carefully shaped, persistently fed, and always just out of reach. Hope is a control mechanism. Hope is a powerful motivator. It lifts people out of despair, keeps them moving forward, and provides meaning during hardship. But when used with intent, hope can also be a leash. Not the kind that restrains by force, but the kind that keeps you walking in circles, always believing that the destination is just a little farther. In many high-control environments, hope isn't offered freely. It's engineered, carefully, strategically. It's presented as something attainable, but only through obedience. You're told that a better version of you is just on the other side of more commitment, more sacrifice, more surrender. You'll reach peace. You'll gain understanding. You'll be chosen. But that day never comes. This kind of hope doesn't feel like inspiration. It feels like debt, a vague sense that you owe the group something before you can receive what's been promised. So you strive. You try to think the right thoughts, speak the right words, feel the right emotions, and if the fulfillment still doesn't come, you're told you must not be ready. You must still have more work to do. The beauty of this system is its flexibility. No matter how long you wait or how much you give, the promise can always be moved a little further away. You're not being punished, you're being prepared. The leader says they see your potential, that they believe in you, that the breakthrough is coming soon. You're flattered by this. You feel chosen just for being told you could be chosen. The hope becomes addictive, not because it's irrational, but because it's deeply personal. You want it to be true. You want to feel whole. You want your suffering to mean something. So you reinterpret every failure, every delay, as a sign that the process is working. The worse it feels, the more convinced you become that something sacred must be happening. Others around you may even serve as living proof. Someone else receives praise. Someone else gets promoted. Someone else claims to have had the spiritual or emotional breakthrough you've been chasing. You're told that if they achieved it, so can you. Their story becomes your roadmap, even if you don't know what they endured to play that role. Eventually, hope isn't something you hold, it's something that holds you. You're no longer free to walk away without feeling like you've given up on something precious. You're told that people who leave always regret it, that only those who stay find fulfillment. So you stay, not out of fear, not anymore, but because you still believe that the next step might finally bring what was promised from the beginning. This is how hope becomes a cage. Not by denying you the future, but by defining it for you and always keeping it just beyond your reach. But the system doesn't run on hope alone. To keep you in place, to keep your effort fueled, it also draws on something heavier, something more corrosive. A weight you carry without knowing when you picked it up. And it isn't even yours. Shame that isn't yours. Some burdens arrive quietly. You don't remember agreeing to carry them. They don't belong to you, yet they settle into your spine like you were born with them. Shame is one of those burdens, and in high-control groups, it's one of the most reliable tools of influence, not because it's obvious, but because it's invisible until it's already working. In these systems, shame often doesn't start with what you've done. It starts with who you are. From the beginning, you're told that something in you is broken. Not fatally, but fundamentally. You're taught that the group or leader has the cure, the knowledge, the way to fix what's wrong. But first, you must admit to the sickness. You must see yourself the way they see you, flawed, confused, incomplete. This isn't framed as cruelty. It's described as honesty, as love. You're not being judged, they say. You're being helped. But help in this context always comes with a price. It demands that you believe their view of your inner life more than your own, that you surrender your self-perception in exchange for their approval. Over time, this engineered shame becomes your second skin. You start to police your feelings, not just your actions. Did I feel proud when I shouldn't have? Was that thought disloyal? Am I seeking attention for the wrong reasons? The rules don't always need to be spoken. You internalize them through reactions, subtle corrections, withheld affection, praise that only arrives when you shrink yourself just enough. The most dangerous part is how shame reshapes memory. You begin to reimagine your past through the group's lens. Former joys become signs of arrogance. Old wounds become evidence of deserved suffering. Your life outside the group is reframed as empty, selfish, or naive. And once your past is contaminated, your present becomes a kind of penance for the person you used to be. This form of shame doesn't ask you to reflect, it asks you to regret. Not in a healthy way, where guilt leads to growth, but in a way that stalls your sense of self. You're kept in a permanent state of apology, apologizing for your doubts, your needs, your instincts, for anything that suggests there might still be a core inside you that hasn't been claimed by the group. And because this shame didn't come from within, you can never quite resolve it from within. You rely on the group to tell you when you've done enough, when you've atoned enough, but that permission is rarely granted. There's always more work to do, more humility to show, more ego to shed. So you keep trying, hoping that one day you'll finally be good enough by their definition. But that definition changes. It shifts with the leader's moods, the group's expectations, the unwritten rules that always seem just out of sync with your best efforts. You chase approval like it's oxygen, and all the while, the original source of your shame remains unspoken. Because it was never really about something you did, it was about who they needed you to become. And they shape that identity not just by telling you who you are, but by surrounding you with others who reflect it back, not honestly, but strategically. The group is your mirror. You don't always need to be told who you are. Sometimes it's enough to see it in the eyes of the people around you. High-control groups understand this well. They use the social environment not as a backdrop, but as a tool, a mirror carefully angled to reflect only what serves the system. At first, this feels like connection. You arrive unsure, maybe even broken, and find yourself surrounded by people who claim to understand. They speak your language. They share your questions. They offer stories that sound just enough like your own. It feels like coming home. But slowly, that connection narrows, not in appearance, but in substance. Instead of reflecting your truth, the group begins to reflect only the version of you that they've decided is acceptable. Their approval becomes the measurement of your growth. Their attention, the evidence of your progress. You start to depend on their reactions to know if you're doing well. If you speak a doubt aloud, the response is immediate. A sideways glance, a short silence, a gentle correction. If you echo the approved language, however, if you use the right words, show the right gratitude, you're welcomed warmly, encouraged, praised. It feels like affirmation, but it's actually alignment. And it doesn't take long before you learn to adjust. You begin to self-monitor not just what you say, but how you think. You observe yourself as if through their eyes, trying to see what they would see. You imagine how your reactions might be interpreted. You correct your tone, your posture, your feelings, until what comes out of you is no longer spontaneous, but curated. The group doesn't need to coerce you anymore. You've internalized the mirror. You carry it with you everywhere. There's another layer to this. It isn't just about control. It's about identity. In these environments, who you are becomes who you are to the group. You're known by your role, your testimony, your transformation. You become part of the narrative, a character in a larger story. And stepping outside that identity, asking who you might be without it, feels like betrayal, not just of the group, but of yourself. This dynamic is especially strong in communities that claim spiritual or moral authority. The stakes feel higher. Disapproval doesn't just mean you've misstepped, it means you've failed to evolve, failed to transcend. So the fear of being seen as less enlightened or less committed keeps you performing even when you're exhausted. Eventually, it becomes difficult to distinguish genuine connection from conditional acceptance. You wonder if your friends like you, or just the version of you that fits. You wonder if you've ever shown them anything real, or if, all along, you were only reflecting back what they wanted to see. This is how identity is softened, then rewritten, not through force, but through subtle reflection. You adapt to survive. You conform to belong. And just as you begin to lose sight of your original self, the group offers something else, a promise, one that keeps you striving, one that feels like hope, but functions like gravity. The promise of transformation. It begins with a whisper that who you are is not enough, not damaged necessarily, but incomplete. You're told you've been walking through life half asleep, carrying weight that doesn't belong to you, that your guilt, your fear, your confusion, none of it originates from within. It was handed to you by a broken world. And now, finally, there is a way to be free. You don't need to be fixed, they say. You need to be transformed, not tweaked or guided, but reshaped from the inside out. This isn't therapy, it's rebirth, a radical undoing of who you were, so something higher, truer, and cleaner can emerge. And unlike the slow crawl of self-help or the ambiguity of traditional growth, this metamorphosis is near, tangible, inevitable. All you have to do is stay close. Trust the process. Let go of your defenses. Surrender. At first, it feels exhilarating. You're told you are not your past, not your wounds, not your limits. That buried beneath your hesitation is a better self, more loving, more powerful, more awake, and they can help you reach it. You're given language for your pain, rituals for your hope, and a purpose that feels like a rescue. Finally, a path where everything makes sense. But soon the path narrows. Transformation, it turns out, has rules. You must learn to speak in their terms, think in their metaphors, and feel only the emotions that fit their model. Doubt becomes resistance. Anger becomes ego. Grief becomes blockage. Every deviation from their ideal is reinterpreted as a flaw in you, not because you're bad, but because you haven't surrendered fully enough yet. What began as a journey towards self-discovery slowly becomes one of self-replacement. You're not uncovering your truth. You're trading it for theirs. Your past is reframed as a series of wrong turns. Your intuition is something to be questioned. Your instincts become suspect. You start to wonder if I'm becoming someone new who gets to decide what that someone should be. And then you realize they already have. The you that's allowed to emerge is one that serves the group's narrative, their values, their needs. The more you align, the more you're praised. You're called brave for letting go of who you were, courageous for questioning everything except them, affirmed for surrendering to something bigger than yourself. But beneath the praise is a quiet warning. Transformation is only celebrated when it moves in their direction. So, you adapt. At first, eagerly, then cautiously, then mechanically. You begin filtering your thoughts before you speak. You flinch at emotions that once felt natural. You anticipate corrections before they're given. And slowly, you stop checking in with your own compass. Because the new compass, the group's compass, always points to the same destination. Stay close, stay changed, stay grateful. You begin to perform your growth. You nod at ideas you don't quite feel. You share insights you're not sure you believe. You act wise, healed, awakened, because that's what's expected now. That's what a transformed person does. Even when the transformation starts to feel hollow, even when the version of yourself that emerges starts to feel distant, scripted, not entirely real. This is how transformation becomes confinement. Not because change is bad, but because it's been narrowed to a single shape. You're not expanding, you're conforming. Anything in you that doesn't serve the system, your doubts, your questions, your individuality, is framed as resistance to growth, a blockage to be removed. And bit by bit, it is. Eventually, you don't just lose who you were, you lose the ability to recognize what you've lost. And if unease creeps in, you're told it's part of the process. That disorientation means the ego is dissolving. That pain is purification. That doubt is proof you're close. And you want to believe it, because you've given so much. Your time, your trust, your voice. To question it now would mean facing the unbearable possibility that you surrendered yourself for nothing. So you keep going, hoping the version of yourself they promised is still ahead. The one who no longer hesitates, who floats above confusion, who feels only peace. A self that is finally finished. But finished, in this context, doesn't mean whole. It means quiet, compliant, predictable, safe for them, and far from the raw, contradictory, unfinished self that once dared to grow without permission. And safety like that always has a price. One that rarely announces itself. One that is never paid all at once. Safety that costs your mind. At first, it's hard to notice what's being traded. Safety doesn't announce itself with a price tag. It feels like warmth in a cold world, a place to rest your questions, a structure to hold your uncertainty. And when someone offers it, when they look you in the eye and say, "You don't have to figure it all out anymore," it's easy to lean in, especially if you've spent a lifetime feeling like you were one step behind some invisible truth. They don't offer safety through fences or locks. There are no walls, no armed guards. The protection comes through belief, through the calm certainty of a system that explains everything. Why people are cruel, why the world feels chaotic, why you've always felt like you don't quite belong. The message is soft but firm. Within these ideas, these practices, these truths, you are safe, you are seen, you are home. And for a while, it feels like you've arrived. You're surrounded by others who nod when you speak, who finish your thoughts before you do, who share the same language, the same hopes, the same fears. The group offers a clarity the outside world never did. It replaces ambiguity with purpose, questions with answers, doubt with direction. You don't have to sift through endless options anymore. The right way to think, to act, to feel, it's already laid out. All that's left is to follow. But safety isn't always freedom, and clarity isn't always truth. It begins quietly. You're told to be mindful of your thoughts, to examine them, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. A negative feeling might mean you're slipping. A question might mean you're drifting. You're reminded that doubt is how the old pain seeps back in, that to stay safe, you must stay aligned. So you begin to pre-edit your mind. You catch certain thoughts before they settle. You downplay discomfort. You reframe questions as personal failures. Not because anyone forces you, but because you've internalized the need to protect your place here, to stay good, to stay safe. Over time, the boundary between what you believe and what you're told to believe begins to dissolve. Your inner monologue starts to mimic the teachings. Your instincts get overridden by doctrine. You don't even notice when it happens because everyone around you is doing the same, repeating the same insights, smiling through the same discomfort. And it all feels safe. There's relief in no longer wrestling with big questions, in knowing who to trust, in having an answer ready for every dilemma. Life feels cleaner, simpler. You stop scanning the horizon for threats because now you're told exactly where they are. The system becomes your map, and the group your compass. But gradually, a different kind of weight settles in. Not panic, not distress, just a quiet dulling. A stillness that doesn't feel quite like peace. You notice your thoughts looping instead of stretching. The same mantras, the same slogans, the same reassurances over and over. Your inner world, once full of unpredictable sparks and winding paths, now spins in a tight circle. It no longer expands. It echoes. You hesitate before imagining alternatives, not because they're wrong, but because they feel unsafe. You avoid certain thoughts, not because they hurt, but because you've learned they're dangerous. You sense that some part of you has grown silent, not out of healing, but out of habit. And that's the cost. Not just the beliefs you surrendered, but the mental landscape you flattened. The part of you that once asked, "What if?" The part that chased connections, that challenged the obvious, that was willing to be wrong. That part hasn't disappeared. It's just been quietly told to wait, and wait, and wait. They promised safety. And in many ways, they delivered. You sleep more easily. You smile more predictably. You speak with confidence. But deep down, you know some of that calm is borrowed, conditioned, maintained. Because the most powerful form of control doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like alignment. It feels like belonging. It feels like relief. It's the subtle message that freedom is dangerous, that your unaided thoughts are untrustworthy, that wandering minds get hurt. And when you accept that, you no longer need anyone to trap you. You trap yourself. Not because you love the cage, but because they've taught you to fear the open sky. If some part of this journey left you thinking, quietly, perhaps even uncomfortably, you're not alone. These aren't just tactics used in distant, extreme corners of the world. They're patterns that echo in more places than we like to admit. In relationships, institutions, movements, in the quiet bargains we make with ourselves to feel safe, accepted, or certain. If a particular moment in this video stayed with you, a phrase, an idea, a feeling, you're welcome to share it below. Sometimes the most honest thoughts come not in arguments, but in reflections. And if you'd like to continue wandering these strange, difficult, and revealing paths with us into psychology, philosophy, and the shadowed edges of human behavior, feel free to subscribe. It helps this channel grow in the way we like best, slowly, thoughtfully, and with care. And if this video offered something of value, a pause, a new angle, or just the company of a quiet voice in a loud world, a like goes a long way. Thanks for being here. Sleep well.